Hey guys! Tonight we're heading into the fog-drenched valleys and wind-bitten ridges of medieval Iceland, where the sheep outnumber the people, the nights go on forever, and, most importantly, the dead don't always stay in the ground. You'll be walking narrow paths between turf-roofed farmhouses, their doors heavy, their hinges old, where someone's great-aunt may still be pacing the fields 3 winters after her burial. Oh, and if she breaks your fence, or curses your cow, you might just be legally entitled to sue her. Yes, sue her. Welcome to the island where ghosts didn't just haunt people, they showed up in court records. Now, let's be honest. You probably wouldn't survive this trip. The winters alone could undo even the hardiest among us, and that's before you factor in volcanic ash, unpredictable neighbors, and the casual possibility of being slapped by an undead fisherman. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening with a cup of tea or tucked under a weighted blanket, tell me your location and your local time. I love seeing where and when you drift off. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge slowly through frost-stiffened grass, your boots crunching the ground with the same dry snap you've heard all day. The same rhythm of people making their way toward the spring ing. The great communal legal assembly where laws are spoken, disputes settled, and, apparently, ghosts sometimes dragged in for questioning. Well, not physically, but their names come up. Their behavior is described in detail. Eyewitnesses testify. Some families even bring saga scrolls or carved runes to bolster their claims, because in Iceland, legal memory is oral, visual, persistent. And already, the scene feels tense. Not violent, but pressurized. These gatherings are the lifeblood of Icelandic society in the 10th and 11th centuries. Half courthouse, half picnic, part theater, part purge. And today, one of the complaints being discussed? A ghost, or more specifically, a revenant. A restless dead person who won't leave a certain sheepfold alone. He doesn't say much, mostly groans, but he's been trampling fences, disturbing livestock, and possibly cursing the milk. You're not sure how that part's proven, but it was said with great conviction. And this isn't some tavern-side superstition. It's recorded, filed, entered into the chain of Icelandic legal memory, where judgments become precedent and precedent becomes power. It's part of a wider tradition of turning every grievance, every harm, into something that can be spoken, deliberated, and codified, including hauntings. Historians still argue whether Icelanders truly believed ghosts could be legally bound, or whether these were symbolic cases, ways to hold the living accountable for the dead's behavior. Was suing someone's ghost a kind of coded accusation? A polite way of saying, "You didn't bury your uncle right, and now he's stomping through my dreams and ruining my rye bread." Regardless of the intent, the effect was very real. Laws were consulted, witnesses called, remedies discussed. Sometimes the outcome was reburial or exorcism by a priest. Other times, the resolution was compensation, a goat, a cart of hay, or a promise to perform the proper rites. There were even cases where the landowner of a haunted field had to temporarily vacate their home until the disturbance passed. Ghosts were treated less like mysterious beings and more like unruly neighbors. You walk along the legal lane, just a trampled stretch of ground between tents, listening to an older man recount how his wife's sister's cousin saw a figure standing at the end of her bed 3 nights in a row. Not just standing, sniffing. She smelled like wet fur and old hay, he says. The court laughs, but the scribe keeps writing. Because this, too, is evidence. And what makes Iceland unique isn't just that it documented these ghost stories. It's that it structured them legally, embedding the supernatural into a real, living system of arbitration. Revenants were categorized. Was the ghost vengeful or merely disoriented? Had it spoken? Had it harmed a human or just property? These distinctions mattered. A ghost that only trampled crops was less serious than one that touched the living. But both could be pursued through law. You pause to warm yourself beside a low campfire. A group of young men are debating an older case from 2 winters ago, when a woman claimed she saw a glowing man walking the ridge behind her home. She sued her neighbor, claiming he failed to properly bury his cousin, whose ghost she believed it was. The neighbor countered that she was using the story to delay a land boundary claim. No one could prove anything, except that both sides had believed the ghost existed, if only as a legal strategy. And this is the key. Ghosts didn't have to be real to matter. They only had to be believable to enough people in the right context. That's all a legal system ever needs. So you settle into the edge of a tent as the sky darkens into the soft mauve of an Icelandic evening. Across the way, someone's reciting an old verdict, his voice rhythmic, practiced. It's about a haunting that ended in a shared burial. The 2 families, once feuding, buried their ancestors together, believing it would pacify the revenants and seal the legal truce. Did it work? No one's sure, but the fields stopped whispering after that. And so begins your walk through this strange, creaking logic of medieval Iceland, where the dead could be disruptive, and the law was robust enough to handle them. Where justice didn't stop at the grave. It simply adjusted the filing system. You wake to the sound of boots crunching on frozen moss. Someone's already walking the path toward the spring inn, wrapped in a wool cloak, muttering under their breath about sheep, neighbors, and possibly ghosts. Though it's hard to tell, as all 3 seem to get tangled in Icelandic disputes. You stretch, rising stiffly from your bedroll, and remember, today you're learning why, in this island of winds and whispers, everyone sued everyone else, and occasionally, they sued the dead too. The thing is, medieval Iceland wasn't governed by kings or lords in the way most of Europe was. There were no castles here, no armored knights, no courtly bureaucracy with scribes in velvet robes. There was just the Althing, a national assembly held each summer, and a network of local gatherings where disputes were hashed out with a mixture of law, poetry, and thinly veiled threats. And so, when something went wrong, be it an insult, a broken promise, a cow that died suspiciously, or, yes, a haunting, you sued. You didn't always expect to win. That wasn't the point. The act of filing a lawsuit was a statement of power. A public act of naming, of shaping a story so others would remember it your way. And in a place as small, tight-knit, and gossipy as medieval Iceland, reputation was currency. Lawsuits were, in some ways, the primary form of public storytelling. Historians still argue whether this rampant litigiousness was a necessity or a cultural pastime. Was it the absence of centralized authority that made people lean on lawsuits? Or was it simply that the Icelandic people, steeped in oral tradition, valued the narrative structure of a trial? Claim, counterclaim, witness, verdict? Whatever the cause, the effect was astonishing. You had entire sagas, long, poetic histories, structured like legal depositions. So-and-so's father insulted so-and-so's sister. A goat wandered onto forbidden pasture. Someone's cousin didn't build a fence high enough. Lawsuits were filed, compensation demanded, and sometimes revenants appeared, as if the tension in the village had conjured them straight from the frost. You walk past a pair of farmers arguing about who owns a collapsed shed. One mutters that the building's been haunted since his aunt died in it. The other smirks. Then sue her, he says. And he's not entirely joking. Because there are cases, scattered in the law books and saga scrolls, where the dead were effectively treated as liable parties. If someone's ghost disrupted your peace, your livestock, or your night's sleep, that was considered a harm. And in Iceland, harms required redress. You make your way through a circle of tents where a speaker is reciting passages from Gragas, the medieval Icelandic law code. The words are thick with frostbitten consonants and long pauses. Somewhere in the list of provisions, after the livestock clauses and the churchyard ordinances, comes a curious phrase: if a man dies and disturbs the peace of the living, the matter shall be brought before witnesses, and the site of unrest shall be named aloud. In other words, if the dead are causing problems, speak up. Formally. And it wasn't just about superstition. The ghost might not be the issue. The real problem could be a failure in burial rites, a hidden feud, a debt unpaid. Ghost sightings were often used as a kind of legal pressure valve, a way to force conversations no one wanted to have. The haunting gave you cover to act. You weren't accusing your neighbor of murder. You were just saying his dead uncle wouldn't stop knocking on your barn door. You stop at a stall where a scribe is selling hand-copied saga excerpts, folded vellum sheets inked with stories of hauntings, reburials, and strange moans heard on winter nights. One passage stands out. The man returned on the third night and sat by the fire. He spoke not, but all agreed it was him. They demanded a trial. It's vague and chilling, but it captures the Icelandic logic perfectly. If someone shows up after death and disrupts the world of the living, due process must follow. In one particularly famous tale, a man named Orulf, stout, stubborn, and absolutely furious about dying, continued to roam the land long after burial, breaking doors and snarling at livestock. His family didn't dare approach, so a neighbor sued, not for damages exactly, but for peace. The court ruled that Orulf must be reburied on higher ground, away from the village. The haunting stopped, Case closed. It wasn't always so simple. In some cases, ghost lawsuits became proxy battles. One side used the haunting to challenge an inheritance. Another tried to delay a land sale by claiming the property was cursed. Legal maneuvering wrapped itself around the haunting like fog over lava fields, sometimes sincere, sometimes strategic, always weirdly civil. And lawsuits didn't always involve courts. Sometimes the mere threat of a suit was enough to spur action. Bury your grandmother properly, or I'll summon the neighbors and speak her name aloud. That could be enough to provoke a reburial, a public apology, or even a settlement of sheep. Ghosts gave people leverage. The Icelanders had a term for those who stirred up this kind of unrest. Dragamal, literally, ghost matter. It was distinct from murder, theft, or blasphemy. It lived in a strange liminal zone, between law and lore, between fear and fact. And yet it was treated with as much seriousness as any other dispute. The ghost was not just a story. It was a legal inconvenience. You stop beside a row of staked-out parchment scrolls, fluttering faintly in the wind. They've been laid out by a local chieftain, who offers readings in exchange for a coin or a favor. One tale tells of a woman who sued her husband's ghost for unresolved affection. The court didn't issue punishment, but required a public rite. She placed his favorite tool on his grave and recited his name aloud 3 times. It worked, allegedly. And that's what you keep returning to. The blend of performance and belief. Did people truly expect a court case to make a ghost go away? Or was the court merely the theater where deeper issues could be aired? As the sun dips low and mist begins to gather in the hollows, you find yourself back at the circle of tents. Someone is hammering a post into the ground, setting up a space for tomorrow's hearing. You ask what it's about. A man shrugs. A man says his cousin's been moaning under the floorboards. Says the burial was rushed. Might be a land issue. Then he adds, he'll sue. We'll see. And that, in a nutshell, is the Icelandic way. When haunted, litigate. When cursed, convene. When in doubt, file the paperwork. You step into the clearing just as the morning fog lifts, revealing the outlines of turf shelters, low fire pits, and dozens of cloaked figures moving slowly toward the assembly hill. This is the Ing, Iceland's open-air parliament, its court, its gossip circle, its moral compass, and today, perhaps, its ghost tribunal. There's no judge's bench or carved courtroom. Just a patch of land, marked by custom and memory, where disputes are aired in public and laws are not read from books but spoken aloud, because for most of Iceland's early legal history, there were no books at all, only voices. You find a spot beside a flat boulder used as a makeshift table. Someone's carved shallow grooves into its surface, possibly to hold coins or small tokens of evidence. A local law speaker, his voice scratchy from age and salt air, begins reciting from memory a passage from Grogus, Iceland's medieval law code. How to resolve a dispute over land boundaries, how to settle a claim for theft, and, as the murmuring crowd begins to lean closer, how to proceed if a ghost has become a nuisance. This might be your favorite part of Icelandic legal culture, the way the supernatural was threaded into the same system that managed sheep trespasses and hay theft. The dead weren't sequestered in myth. They were procedural. They showed up in testimony. They were weighed in judgment. They lingered in clauses that assumed, implicitly, that revenants and restless spirits were not just real, but manageable, given the right words, the right rights, and the right forms of redress. You shift your weight on the cold stone, listening as the law speaker describes a case from a generation ago. A man named Geirmundur had died in a house dispute and was seen afterward walking through his neighbor's barn. The barn was sealed, offerings made, and when the disturbances didn't stop, the neighbor filed a complaint. Not against the ghost per se, but against Geirmundur's living cousin, whose failure to rebury the man in sacred ground was blamed for the unrest. This is crucial. Ghosts were rarely sued in isolation. More often, legal responsibility was transferred back onto the living. If someone disturbed the peace, their kin bore the burden. A haunting wasn't just a horror, it was a liability. Historians still debate how often this actually happened versus how much was stylized in the sagas. Some argue that ghost lawsuits were less about belief and more about maintaining social harmony in a fragile, spread-out society. Others suggest these trials may have served a dual function, as legal action and spiritual diagnosis. A way to bring unresolved tensions, land conflicts, improper deaths, bad blood, into a space where they could be reshaped into a more palatable narrative. It's not your fault. It's the ghost. You watch a new case unfold. A man stands beside a sheep enclosure, nervously shifting from foot to foot. He claims his brother-in-law's spirit has been causing disruptions, knocking over pails, frightening horses, appearing in the barn doorway. A witness stands to confirm this. "I saw the shape," she says, voice steady. "It moved like him, wore his old cloak." The group around you doesn't laugh. They nod. The law speaker listens. "Was the burial done properly?" he asks. "Did he die with debts unpaid?" More nods. Whispers. These questions matter. Someone produces a woven token, a small cloth packet of herbs and stones, that was found near the supposed haunt site. A charm, someone murmurs. Protection or summons. Another adds. The court's tone shifts. Now the question isn't just about the ghost, but whether someone may have invited it. You realize, suddenly, that this legal system isn't built on hard evidence the way modern courts are. It's built on consensus, on layers of belief, on what the community can agree feels true. And in Iceland's close-knit world, where everyone is both neighbor and witness, that matters more than forensic proof. A priest steps forward. He's not here to exorcise, but to confirm that the man in question was buried in hallowed ground and received a proper death prayer. He did, the priest affirms. But there was no stone placed. The law speaker raises an eyebrow. Then it must be done now. And just like that, the verdict is passed, not with gavel or decree, but with a list of steps. Place the stone. Recite the names. Burn a bundle of sheep's wool on the grave at dawn. A fine may follow, depending on whether livestock were damaged. The crowd murmurs. The ghost, it seems, has been legally addressed. You wander away from the case, finding yourself beside a group of teenagers reenacting an older ghost trial using sticks as props. One pretends to be the ghost, lurching dramatically, arms stiff. Another recites mock testimony. He scared the hens. The hens won't lay. Laughter. But even in play, the structure is respected. The ghost is named. A witness testifies. A judgment is reached. In another part of the Ing field, a woman is recounting her grandmother's story. A haunting that lasted all through one long winter, until the family placed their dead uncle's knife in a stream, letting it be carried away. He left after that, she says. Didn't even sue. And you get it now. The Ing wasn't just a legal forum. It was a ritualized space for healing, where fear could be spoken aloud, where the dead were given rules, where the living could find release through structure. The law made the ghost manageable. The sun dips lower, casting long lines across the grass. A man finishes a reading from Injal's saga, where a woman's ghost appears at a gathering and must be addressed in front of the assembly. They gave her new clothes, the reader says, and she was never seen again. The crowd is silent, not because they believe it happened exactly that way, but because they believe it could. You sit in the fading light, listening to voices rise and fall around you. Not all of them living. Some echoing from memory, from story, from pages not yet written. And you understand now. In Iceland, the law didn't end where life did. It simply took a deep breath and kept going. The morning light filters through a haze of mist, settling on the frost-laced hills that rise beyond the farmsteads. You pass through a narrow gate where the stone fence leans a little too deliberately, as if it knows it's the only thing standing between you and something old. Ahead, the land dips into a shallow field, and just beyond it, you see the remains of a grave mound. Not grand, just a slight swell in the earth. Mossy, quiet, and, according to the woman walking beside you, a known revenant site. Now, revenant is the fancy term for what the Icelanders called a draugr, a being who dies and then, for reasons both mysterious and uncomfortably bureaucratic, comes back. Not as a ghost in the translucent, floaty sense. No, a draugr returns with a body. It's solid, it walks, it groans, sometimes it talks, and always, it harasses the living. The idea wasn't that death was a tidy cutoff point. In Icelandic thought, especially during the medieval period, death was a threshold, and not everyone crossed it cleanly. Some stumbled back, and when they did, they came with grievances, unfinished business, unresolved shame, or simply an extremely strong opinion about how their cousin was managing the livestock. Revenants weren't spooky folklore. They were problematic presences, and sometimes they were dealt with through legal means. The reasons for returning varied. Historians still argue whether revenants were believed to be caused more by improper burial practices or by moral failings in life. One theory suggests that if you died angry, unavenged, or with unfinished property disputes, you were far more likely to end up wandering the fences at night. Others argue that shame, especially being denied a rightful place in society or family, was enough to spark a haunting. You crouch beside the grave mound as your guide explains how some families would bury their dead with extra care to avoid a walking return. This included placing heavy stones on the chest, tying the feet together with cords, and, in more extreme cases, driving nails through the soles of the shoes. You don't ask if that worked. The fact that people did it suggests that, at best, the answer was sometimes. These rituals weren't random. They were codified, passed down orally, and referenced in the law. The Icelanders had burial customs that bordered on procedural paranoia, precisely because a botched burial didn't just mean spiritual unrest. It meant legal complications. A haunting wasn't just frightening, it was a sign that someone had failed in their duties. And when someone fails in their duties in medieval Iceland, what do? You sue them. You walk with a local priest who keeps records of ancient hauntings in his parish. He shows you a copy of a case from the early 12th century. A man named Ron died during a storm and was buried hastily, without the proper rites. Within days, neighbors reported hearing groaning from the hill. Livestock scattered. One boy claimed he saw a figure squatting on the roof of the byre, just watching. A complaint was brought before the local assembly, not to prosecute the ghost, but to assign blame for the improper burial. The solution? Reopen the grave, rebury the man properly, place a cross above the mound, compensate the family whose cows were spooked, and afterward, record the incident in both legal and ecclesiastical memory, because once a ghost enters public discourse, it becomes precedent. You pause beside a small stream, watching the water curl around mossy stones. Your companion tells you about the belief that ghosts couldn't cross running water unless they were especially vengeful, or unless they'd been improperly named at death. If you don't speak the name, he says, they don't know they're dead. Which sounds poetic, until you realize it's a real problem when someone dies in isolation or without witnesses. Suddenly, you're not just dealing with grief. You're dealing with a potential haunting and a lawsuit. There are stories in the sagas, strange, flickering tales, where a person returns, confused, wandering, clearly not malicious but not at rest. And the community must gather to determine who is responsible. Did the family fail to wrap the body correctly? Did someone forget the funeral ale? Was a promised debt never paid? Sometimes, the legal case is less about punishment and more about ritual correction. The ghost is the symptom. The lawsuit is the cure. You listen to a farmer recount how, 3 generations ago, his family home was haunted by a cousin who died abroad but had never been named during the seasonal rites. They didn't even know he was dead until people started seeing him in the smokehouse, arms folded, looking annoyed. They held a proper naming, said prayers. The sightings stopped. We keep his name now, the farmer says, just in case he wants to check in. This balance between belief and bureaucracy is one of Iceland's most charming contradictions. People feared revenants, but they also managed them. They gave them roles, conditions, and in some cases, redress. In a farming culture where land was precious and death a constant neighbor, You couldn't afford to treat hauntings as mere nonsense. If a ghost was real enough to cause disturbance, then it was real enough to require intervention. And often, the intervention took the form of legal response. Not to punish the ghost, but to assign responsibility to someone. You pass a weathered stone marker where, it's said, a known revenant once appeared every spring until his brother returned the sheep he'd borrowed in life and never returned. It wasn't the haunting, the local woman tells you. It was the debt. That's what kept him. You glance at the stone. It's not elaborate, but someone carved a name into it. A date. Maybe that's what it took to let him go. As twilight falls, you head back toward the village. Smoke rises from hearths. Shadows stretch across frost-tipped fields. Somewhere behind you, an owl calls, low and throaty, like a question you can't quite answer. And you understand. In Iceland, the dead didn't just wander. They testified. And the living? They answered. With rites, with law, with stories etched into wind-worn stones. The wind picks up as you cross a ridge overlooking a jagged coastline, the sea far below crashing against rocks with a rhythm older than memory. You pull your cloak tighter, though the locals barely notice the cold. They've grown used to the island's sharp air and, apparently, it's even sharper lawsuits. Today, though, you're not here to visit farmers or graveyards. You're here to meet one of medieval Iceland's most paradoxical figures. The lawspeaker, a man equal parts human record-keeper, conflict negotiator, and, on rare but memorable occasions, reluctant ghost consultant. At the heart of Iceland's legal system was the lögsaguar, or lawspeaker. He was chosen not because he carried scrolls. Books were rare and precious, but because he carried the law in his mind. The lawspeaker had to memorize the law code, often in its entirety, and recite a portion of it at each national assembly. He was judge and reference, precedent and voice. And while his primary duties focused on property disputes, land rights, and blood feuds, sometimes he found himself in more unusual roles. Like advising villagers on what to do when the dead started knocking on walls. You're seated now beside one such man, at least, a portrayal of him, offered through stories passed down by families who've lived on this land for generations. The current resident, a distant descendant, keeps a small journal of his ancestors' rulings, handwritten summaries of cases brought before him during his tenure. One of the entries, smudged at the edges, reads simply, "Complaint. Noise from below floor. Resolution. Rebury father further west, offer apology aloud." And beneath that, a note, "No recurrence." You blink, because there it is again, that incredible Icelandic confidence in procedure as solution. If the dead are disturbed, respond. If the haunting continues, adjust the response. Don't panic. Don't banish. Just revise the burial or hold a formal speaking of the name. The ghosts, it seems, respect process. Historians still argue whether law speakers truly believed in revenants, or simply treated them as extensions of unsolved social disputes. One camp sees ghost litigation as a clever tool, a way to reframe conflict without overt blame. Another insists the legal approach reflects deep cultural belief, not in ghosts as monsters, but as persistent presences, refusing to be forgotten until justice or ritual was complete. You flip through a reproduction of Grogus and find a clause addressing unresolved deaths. It doesn't say ghost exactly, but it refers to a soul unsettled and mandates a speaking before witnesses to mark the ending of a person's legal identity. This wasn't superstition, it was juridical closure. If someone's death left emotional or financial debris, that unfinished business could echo, and sometimes, those echoes were treated like entities. You're told of a case where the law speaker was summoned not to rule on a ghost's guilt, but to determine who should be held responsible for a haunting in the household. The family had reburied the relative twice. They had performed the rites. Yet still, the man's shape was seen in the hallways. A shadow, a scent, the clink of a spoon in a room no one had entered. The law speaker's response? He required public confession, not from the ghost, of course, but from the eldest son, who had neglected to pay a debt owed to the deceased. The son agreed. The haunting stopped. The record ends with a single line: peace returned. There's an odd comfort in that kind of logic. The dead aren't irrational. They just have needs, and if you can meet those needs, through reburial, debt repayment, or ritual acknowledgement, you can restore balance. It's a bit like medieval ghost therapy, with paperwork. You sit with a younger priest who's been studying the overlap between legal and religious practices in medieval Iceland. The lines blur, he says. If a ghost was making noise in the churchyard, you might call the priest. But if that didn't work, you called the law speaker. He couldn't cast out spirits, but he could assign responsibility. And often, that was what mattered most. Not banishing the ghost, but naming the cause. You pass through a glacial valley where people still whisper about a haunting that lasted 3 seasons. The local story is that the ghost never touched anyone, but the law speaker insisted a full property inventory be taken. After that, the noises stopped. You raise an eyebrow at the guide, who shrugs. Maybe the ghost just wanted the books balanced. That sounds absurd, until you remember how much Iceland's entire legal system rested on balance. Of land, of words, of honor debts. And honor, in this culture, was not something that ended with breath. If someone had died wrongly, or with shame, or without being heard, their presence lingered. Not to terrify, just to remind. And so the law speaker, respected, reluctant, overworked, became something like an afterlife auditor. Ensuring that names were spoken, that wrongs were righted, that even the faintest claims from the dead were acknowledged with the same dignity as disputes among the living. As twilight drapes across the low hills, you watch a reenactment of a typical ghost advisory session. A young woman describes her father appearing near the edge of their sheepfold each dusk. The law speaker listens. He asks how the father was buried, whether debts were left unresolved, if a promise had been broken. He nods slowly, then speaks. Reaffirm the inheritance with your brother. Leave a portion of wool at his grave. It's theatrical, but you notice something odd. Everyone in the audience is quiet, still, listening as if the ghost himself might be nearby. And maybe, in Iceland, he is. Because here, law doesn't end with death. It listens, patiently, for footsteps just beyond the door. The sun is a thin smear of gold behind the clouds when you step into a courtyard surrounded by low turf walls and wooden eaves dusted with soot. A child darts past you, giggling, her hands filled with carved wooden sheep. But her older brother pauses, points to a shadow near the barn, and says, quite plainly, "That's where the ghost stood." Then he runs off after her, as if he'd just named a puddle. You glance toward the barn. The spot is empty, but someone's hung a sprig of juniper from the doorframe, and in Iceland, that means someone's had enough of revenant behavior. It's time to learn the basics. Revenant behavior 101, if you will. Because in medieval Iceland, hauntings weren't all creaks and cold drafts. They were tactile, loud, and occasionally very, very physical. Revenants, or draugr, as we've mentioned, were not wispy or subtle. These were not your garden variety moaners. They moved objects, injured livestock, appeared in bodily form, and sometimes engaged in extremely unneighborly activities like sitting on people's chests until they stopped breathing. Some sagas describe them as bloated, dark-skinned corpses that smelled like seaweed and rot. Others were eerily lifelike, indistinguishable from the living until you noticed they were walking in from the wrong side of the graveyard. Historians still debate whether draugr were believed to be actual reanimated corpses or more like persistent spirits capable of limited physical interaction. Either way, they were feared not for their mystery, but for their predictable mischief. Like that uncle who shows up uninvited and criticizes your roof thatching. A draugr had an agenda, and they stuck to it. You walk into the barn where the latest sightings supposedly occurred. A pale patch of straw on the floor. A broken yoke in the corner. Someone scratched a small rune into the beam nearest the door, protection, or maybe just a warning. The farmer tells you, almost casually, that the ghost trampled a cow 2 nights ago. Just the one, he says. Didn't touch the hay. You blink. That level of specificity is not what you expected. But that's the pattern. These ghosts weren't vague, they were habitual. They stuck to routines, returned to specific doors, appeared at predictable times, haunted locations tied to personal history, a hearth, a stable, a field boundary. Their actions were often read as messages: unfinished business, improper burial, or, in one unsettling tale, sheer boredom. You hear about a woman named Gunhildr whose ghost would come sit in the same chair every dusk, sigh loudly, and then vanish. People tried moving the chair. She stood instead. They tried blocking the door. She knocked from the outside. Eventually, someone placed her old shawl over the backrest and said her name aloud during a family meal. That night, she didn't come. Nor the next. Another ghost, a man named Bjarni, allegedly strangled sheep. This was not metaphoric. Witnesses swore they saw a shadowy figure kneeling beside the animals in the fog. When villagers tried to move the sheepfold, the hauntings followed. The local lawspeaker, weary from a long winter, ruled that the sheep should be blessed and the body reburied with 2 coins and a blade. This oddly specific combination seemed to work. The sheep lived. The ghost retired. You ask a local herder if he believes in revenants. He doesn't even look up from sharpening his blade. I believe in problems, he says. And sometimes problems come with faces. Which is probably the most Icelandic answer possible. Sometimes, revenants were even talkative. In one saga, a ghost returned to tell his family not to bury his sword with him because he'd changed his mind. In another, a drogher complained about the smell of the new housekeeper. It's like fish left in the sun, he supposedly said. The family did not replace her, but they did burn incense. The ghost stopped commenting. These accounts seem absurd until you consider that Icelanders weren't trying to write horror stories, they were reporting disturbances. And these disturbances followed patterns. The ghosts weren't chaotic. They had motives, logic, and that meant, in theory, they could be managed. You visit a shrine where people once left offerings to keep revenants calm. Small things. A bone carved with a name, a bundle of wool, a smooth stone. Gifts for memory, the shrine keeper explains. Not payment, just recognition. And then there's the ghost of Eyvindur, who returned only to nap in the loft, wrapped in his burial shroud like a particularly judgmental roll of cloth. He never hurt anyone, but no one wanted to live in the house where he kept showing up. The land was eventually sold at a discount, with a clause. Buyer accepts the presence of Eyvindur if he returns. The saga notes the buyer was a widower. He welcomed the company, it says. You laugh, but there's something touching about that. Not all revenants were malevolent. Some were lonely, some confused. One story tells of a ghost who lingered only because he'd never been told his wife remarried. When she finally stood over his grave and explained the situation, he was never seen again. The spectrum of revenant behavior, from violent to melancholic, destructive to mildly inconvenient, mirrored the full range of human emotion. Which makes sense, because in Iceland, the dead didn't become angels or demons. They became a problem for the community. You stand in the threshold of a barn as the wind rustles through the grass, carrying with it the scent of ash and wool. Somewhere nearby, a dog growls softly. A raven lands on a fence post, stares at you, then takes off again without a sound. There's nothing overtly spooky about it, but there's weight in the air. Because in this place, ghosts weren't exceptions. They were part of the social landscape. Sometimes annoying, sometimes tragic, occasionally dangerous, but always deserving of response. So you brush the straw from your coat and move on, reminded that in Iceland, even the dead get into habits. And if your cow stops producing milk for 3 days in a row, it might not be the feed. It might just be the ghost in the barn who dislikes your tone. The wind rattles a wooden shutter as you step into a longhouse, low-roofed and dim, the air thick with peat smoke and the faint, unmistakable scent of curdled milk. A woman offers you a seat by the hearth, where she's been stirring something sour and suspicious in a clay pot. The cows stopped giving, she says without ceremony. Again, you raise an eyebrow, and you think it's, she nods, as if you're a bit slow. The ghost, of course. Welcome to the surprisingly litigious world of Icelandic supernatural blame. Because in a land where every household depended on its few animals and small plot of earth, any disruption could become a crisis. And if that disruption smelled ghostly, well, someone had to answer for it. In this section, you're diving into the surprisingly robust history of people claiming that a ghost killed their cow, soured their butter, or threw their tools into the fjord, and, more to the point, suing someone over it. You examine the pot. It's a viscous grayish mess. She says the milk soured overnight, again, and this time the runes on the door didn't help. He's still angry, she mutters, referring to the ghost of her late uncle. Still thinks I owed him wool. She's not trying to be poetic. She's offering a case theory. In Icelandic society, where resources were scarce and relationships bound by delicate webs of favor and memory, assigning blame was essential. And while ghosts couldn't be fined or flogged, the living were still very much on the hook. If someone's poorly buried aunt came back to harass your pantry, it could spark a hearing. One tale involves a family who claimed their crops kept failing because a man they refused to bury with his dog returned nightly to breathe on the barley. Not trample, not burn, just breathe. The crops withered. The family sued the deceased's nephew for improper rights. He countered by saying the man had hated barley anyway. The court ordered a reburial, dog included. The crops recovered. The story is now told with a wink, but the legal filing was real. Historians still debate how often these cases occurred versus how often they were invented later for saga color. But records do exist, scattered references in law scrolls, oral histories, and ecclesiastical notes, where ghost-induced damage was cause for compensation. If your tools went missing every night, and neighbors agreed there'd been a sighting, you could petition to have the ghost's relatives perform amends. You walk through a field where a sheep once ran itself to death, allegedly after being stared at by a dead man's shadow. The farmer who lost the sheep sued the deceased's brother for failing to secure the grave. The court heard testimony from 3 witnesses who described a coldness in the air and a muttering that sounded like the dead man's prayer. The verdict: compensate the sheep's value with salted fish. It's easy to laugh, but when you live on the brink of survival, and when the dead are culturally believed to retain grievances, these claims aren't delusional. They're logical extrapolations of Icelandic cosmology. The world was filled with seen and unseen actors, and legal accountability didn't end at the grave. You enter another homestead, where a man gestures to a small pile of burnt herbs and a wooden charm hung above a pantry door. It's for the cheese, he says. It used to vanish. We think it was Hallgrimr. He always liked goat cheese. You ask if he ever considered a formal complaint. He shrugs. Didn't need to. We gave some to his grave. He stopped. But the implication is clear. Had that not worked, legal action might have followed. In one saga, a woman sued her brother-in-law after claiming his deceased sister was haunting her kitchen, spilling broth, breaking jars, and once pushing her into the fire. The court didn't find direct fault with the ghost, because, well, jurisdiction, but fined the brother-in-law for failing to complete the funeral blessing. It's recorded that he performed the rite under duress and muttered curses the whole time. Another tale involves a neighbor dispute over missing hay bales. One party claimed the ghost of a bitter old man was taking the hay and stacking it in his old stable, which had since collapsed. The other party suggested perhaps someone just had bad stacking skills. A local priest was consulted. He found no footprints, but confirmed the air was heavy. Verdict: split the hay and say the man's name aloud 3 times near the ruins. The thread through all of this isn't gullibility, it's social accountability. Ghosts, in these stories, often act as stand-ins for unresolved debts, broken promises, neglected rituals. You're not just dealing with supernatural mischief. You're processing the ripples of human failure, grief, and obligation. A haunting wasn't random, it was provoked, and someone had to take responsibility. Even false claims had weight. If you falsely accused someone of summoning or hosting a revenant, and it turned out they had properly buried their dead, you could be fined for slander. The implication was clear. Ghosts were real enough to litigate, but so was reputation. You finish your tour back at the longhouse, where the woman has set aside a small bowl of milk beside the hearth. For him, she says, nodding toward a corner that looks exactly like every other. He used to like it warm. You ask if she still plans to sue. She shakes her head. Not yet. He hasn't touched the goats. And so the system balances again. A complaint paused, a bowl placed, a gesture made in the flickering half-light between tradition and survival. Because in Iceland, if your butter won't churn, and your chickens won't settle, and your dead uncle keeps eyeing your cheese, you don't panic. You prepare a statement. You wake to the low groan of hinges and the smell of cold ashes, the kind that cling to hearthstones long after the fire's forgotten it ever existed. Outside, the frost glints across the field like scattered salt, and a farmer is already halfway through shouting at someone. You assume it's a neighbor. It's not. It's his grandfather's ghost, and today, he's planning to file a formal complaint. This is where things take a delightful turn. Welcome to the world of supernatural cease and desist orders, medieval style. Because in Iceland, when you had a problem that wouldn't go away, especially one shaped like your dead aunt, you didn't just mutter prayers or build a new fence. No, if the disturbances persisted, you went to the ing and you filed a claim against the ghost. Now, to be clear, ghosts were not technically citizens, nor were they considered sentient agents under Icelandic law. But Icelandic law was a bit like the weather here, flexible, communal, and perfectly willing to adapt to strange circumstances if they persisted long enough. So what emerged over time was a curious patchwork of semi-formal procedures that allowed the living to use the legal system to push back against the dead. It usually worked like this. A person or family, experiencing repeated disturbances, strange sounds, damage to property, livestock agitation, or just plain ghostly appearances, would lodge a public declaration of grievance. This didn't mean suing the ghost directly, but rather, assigning responsibility to someone connected to the ghost. A relative, a neighbor, an officiant who'd botched the funeral rites. The language used in these declarations was often indirect but clear. A typical claim might be, "The peace of my household has been disturbed by the unrest of name, whose grave lies unquiet." From there, the court would hear witness testimony, not necessarily of hauntings themselves, but of the events surrounding them. "I saw the shadow," someone might say, or "the sheep refused to enter the barn after dusk," or even, "My brother hasn't spoken since the ghost sat on his chest." You attend one such mock trial, held for educational purposes but steeped in real legal phrasing. The plaintiff, a wiry man with a red cap and a surprisingly formal tone, claims that the ghost of a former tenant keeps moving his tools. "Always the same ones," he says. "Never the ones I wish he'd fix." His neighbor, a cousin of the deceased, is the defendant, not because he did anything, but because he's now the legal steward of the grave. He's supposed to keep it tended, named, and at peace. Historians still argue whether these cases were symbolic acts of social management or genuine attempts to exert juridical power over the supernatural. Some believe they acted as pressure valves for communal tension. Others suggest they reflect a world where the boundary between life and death was more porous, more practical. In either case, the legal rituals served a purpose. They gave people a process. And if you know anything about Icelandic society at this time, it's that process mattered. Everyone had a stake in keeping the social fabric stitched together: landowners, farmers, priests, and yes, even the ghosts. Because the moment something supernatural disrupted that fabric, you needed a framework to talk about it, interpret it, and if possible, resolve it without blood. You pass a wooden post where someone has nailed a small placard, "Disturbance addressed. Peace spoken." It's a leftover from a ghost complaint filed the previous winter, when a woman claimed her dead uncle kept calling out from the chimney flue. She filed a grievance. The priest came. The family performed a naming rite. And now? Just silence. "The air tastes better now," she said afterward. And whether or not that's medically accurate, it was legally satisfying. You leaf through a set of archival notes in the home of a retired scribe. One reads, "Complaint filed by Ora Gummansdottir, claiming her late husband continues to whisper curses during the night. Witnessed by her sister and 3 children. Requested remedy. Public naming and reburial with personal item. The remedy was approved. The husband's grave was reopened. His favorite drinking horn was placed beside him. The haunting ceased. The case was closed." And this is the key. Ghost complaints were often resolved not through punishment, but through ritualized reconciliation. The act of speaking the ghost's name in court, of acknowledging their grievances, of marking their grave with tokens. These weren't just religious gestures. They were legal resolutions, binding in the eyes of the community. Some complaints went further. You hear of a man who demanded compensation for emotional distress caused by a recurring vision of his deceased rival in the forge. The rival had died with a curse on his lips. The court didn't rule on the ghost's behavior. but it did order the rival's son to remove the forged stones and rebuild them, symbolically ending the conflict. Not all cases were accepted. In some regions, local law speakers refused to hear ghost-related complaints unless multiple witnesses confirmed the disturbances. In other areas, ghost grievances were heard only after all earthly explanations had been ruled out. If your hay kept vanishing, and there was no thief to blame, only then might the court entertain a supernatural culprit. You arrive at a clearing where an old man is performing a traditional act known as naming into silence. He stands near a grave mound, speaks the deceased's full name, lineage, and the cause of their unrest, then pauses. The idea is that once a ghost's story is properly told, they have no reason to linger. It's not a trial, but it has legal weight, especially if witnessed. And afterward, no one can claim ignorance. The ghost has been formally acknowledged. As you leave, the man tells you his grandfather used to say, "A ghost only haunts those who pretend they can't hear." But Icelanders, they hear, and they answer, with words, with rights, and, if need be, with court documents. So if your cauldron keeps boiling over, and your cellar grows inexplicably cold, and you keep hearing footsteps that stop when you breathe, don't panic. Just speak the name, file the grievance, respect the process. Because in this place, even the dead are expected to follow the rules. The church bell doesn't ring here, it creaks. It sways on an old timber post beside a chapel made of turf and driftwood, tucked into a pocket of land where the wind always whispers sideways. You stand at its door, staring at a bench strewn with small offerings, bundles of sage, smooth stones, a dried fish head with a tiny carved cross in its mouth. This isn't your standard altar. This is the threshold of legal exorcism, Icelandic style. Today, you're going to explore one of the strangest intersections in medieval Icelandic culture. The point where law and ritual blur, where ghosts aren't just prayed away, they're evicted via procedure. Welcome to the semi-official practice of ritualized ghost expulsion. A practice with just enough legal flavor to make it enforceable, and just enough spiritual weight to actually, allegedly, work. You sit with the local priest, his face more wrinkled than his robe, his hands steady as he lays out what he calls the 3 layers of removal. First, the name must be spoken, in full, ideally in public. Second, the story must be told, how the person lived, how they died, and why their spirit might remain. Third, an act of return, something buried with them, or left in a space they frequented, to encourage rest. Each of these steps mirrors elements of legal proceedings: identification, testimony, restitution. It's no accident. Icelanders, as you've seen, were obsessed with process. And when it came to the dead, the same logic applied. If we can name it, we can manage it. Historians still argue whether these rituals were truly recognized as legal acts or merely tolerated by the law. Some suggest they were a holdover from older pagan practices, gradually retrofitted with Christian symbolism and legal structure. Others believe the law codes quietly allowed for these rites under the umbrella of public peace. That is, Anything that restored harmony to the community was fair game. You flip through an old church ledger where someone has written a record of a disturbance settlement. It reads like a property claim. Revenant seen in the byre, identified by 3 witnesses. Burial site found shallow. Item returned. Carved bone spindle. Disturbance ceased. That's it. No flowery language. Just the facts. The idea was that the spirit wanted something. Attention, justice, or maybe just their old comb. And once that need was fulfilled, they'd go. It wasn't about punishing the ghost. It was about closing the file. You step into the chapel, where the smell of smoke still lingers from the morning's rite. The altar is bare save for a stone bowl filled with water and a copper coin resting at the bottom. Payment, the priest says. Not for the dead, for the silence afterward. He shows you the rite itself. It begins with a recitation of the ghost's lineage, not as a spiritual chant, but as a record, as if reciting a family tree aloud lends weight to the act. Then comes the declaration. We speak your name, and speak your story. What was taken has been returned. Go now with the peace of earth. A pause, then a communal breath. No shouting, no flames, just structure, just order. You recall a saga where a haunting was ended not with a sword or spell, but by rebuilding a wall the ghost had died beside. The court ruled that the house must be made whole to restore spiritual balance. The family complied. The disturbances ended. The ghost wasn't banished. It was accommodated. And this, more than anything, defines Iceland's approach to ghosts. They are not foes. They are legal problems with emotional subtext. Their presence signals a breach, a broken promise, a buried secret, a rite left incomplete. The legal exorcism doesn't scream at the spirit. It acknowledges them. It processes them. You visit a farmhouse where a ghost once appeared every winter, pacing the upper hall. The family filed no suit. They instead held what's known locally as a witness vigil, 3 nights where family members took turns reciting the deceased's name, deeds, and unfinished tasks. At dawn on the 3rd day, they placed his walking staff on the roof. He never returned. We didn't cast him out, the old matriarch says. We just gave him his steps back. Even mischief had its rules. You read of one lazy ghost who did nothing but rearrange tools every night. The family filed a grievance. The local assembly ordered a naming right and a symbolic fence to be built across the ghost's supposed path. It wasn't magical. It was declarative. A way to say, this space is closed. Your time is ended. What's remarkable is how often these actions worked, not because ghosts are inherently obedient, but because communities needed closure, and rituals gave them one. These rites weren't just legal fiction or spiritual theater. They were communal acts of making things right, and in a society where survival depended on unity, that mattered. As dusk falls, you attend a small service. A woman stands by a cairn where her grandmother is buried. She speaks the name 3 times, sets a candle, and says, "You were heard. You were loved. You are done. No thunder, No cold wind, just the rustle of grass and the quiet relief of something finally settled. You walk away with the strong sense that Iceland's ghost laws were never really about the dead. They were about the living. Living with silence. Living with grief. Living with the belief that even shadows, if properly addressed, could go gently. You cross a narrow path edged by loose stones, the kind that seem to shuffle slightly in the wind when no one's watching. The mist clings to the low hills here, and the air feels heavier, as though you're walking through the long exhale of someone who never got to say goodbye. You've come to a piece of land that locals refer to, somewhat uneasily, as the field of second burials. There are no markers, no visible graves, but everyone knows this is where things get reburied when they weren't done right the first time. Because in medieval Iceland, a bad burial wasn't just a spiritual oversight, it was a legal hazard. Fail to lay someone to rest properly, and you might be looking at a court summons, a livestock fine, or worse, a haunting that made your property unsellable. And when land was everything, identity, livelihood, legacy, a haunting could mean financial ruin. You stop beside a blackened stone where someone scratched the word "Harry," I heard. No date, no signature, just a verb. You're told a young man once saw his grandfather walking across this field 2 weeks after burial, head bowed, lips moving. No one heard what he was saying, but they all heard something, and the family ended up reinterring him with a lock of his wife's hair. The sightings stopped, the memory didn't. Improper burial, as you're learning, wasn't always about skipping a ceremony or rushing a rite. Sometimes it was where the person was buried, or with whom, or what they were, or weren't, buried with. If a person didn't receive the right prayers, wasn't placed on sacred ground, or was denied something they were promised in life, it could lead to unrest. Not just from grieving relatives, but from neighbors who didn't want a haunted barn next door. And yes, that led to lawsuits. You pass through a village where an entire section of pasture went unsold for 6 years after a man claimed he saw the shape of a woman walk the boundary at dawn every day. She had died during childbirth, was buried quickly, and without the full rites. Her family believed the problem was spiritual. Her neighbors disagreed, and filed a claim that her improper burial had lowered the value of their adjoining land. The court's solution? The family had to exhume and rebury her with proper ceremony, and erect a symbolic gate at the edge of the field to let her pass peacefully. The sale finally went through the following summer. Historians still argue how much weight was placed on spiritual belief versus legal strategy in these cases. Was it the haunting itself that concerned people, or the reputation of the land? And that's not just academic speculation. Because in Icelandic law, land was so deeply tied to identity that any perception of impurity, be it violence, debt, or ghost, could impact its legal status. You read about a man named Snorri who was buried in a disputed spot, a hilltop both families wanted. His ghost allegedly appeared near a boulder that marked the property line. When one family tried to claim the land, the other insisted the haunting made it unfit. The case dragged on. Eventually, the solution was to move the boulder and reconsecrate the ground. After that, the ghost was never seen again. Or at least, no one said they saw him. You're led to a farmstead where a man died during a snowstorm and was buried on high ground because the earth was too frozen elsewhere. The burial was rushed. No priest was present. The spring thaw brought rumors, cold spots, flickering lights, distant sobbing. The neighbors didn't wait. They brought the case to the ing. Their claim? That the rushed burial was a nuisance, both spiritual and legal. The court ordered a reburial at the proper site, with formal prayers and the presence of 7 witnesses, to ensure transparency. Because in Iceland, just like in any dispute, you needed proof that the burial had been handled according to community standards. Not because ghosts would file a counterclaim, but because neighbors just might. In a nearby village, a family kept their property off the market for over a decade due to a lingering reputation. That's the haunted one. The man in the well. The original burial site had collapsed during flooding. The body was moved, but not, apparently, with enough care. Locals believed the ghost was unsettled. The owners tried legal recourse, arguing that the ghost story was slander. The court didn't rule in their favor, but advised a ritual reburial and public naming, which they performed. Eventually, the land sold. This delicate dance, between belief, fear, and marketability, is one of the more peculiar aspects of Icelandic ghost law. A haunting didn't need to be dramatic. A few bad rumors could be enough to freeze a sale, delay a marriage, or spark a lawsuit. You pause beside a mossy hollow where someone once dug too close to an old grave and claimed a cold hand touched theirs. The story got around. That year's barley grew thin, and people whispered about the field being cursed. It wasn't. It was just unlucky. But the story stuck, and with it, the memory of someone who'd been buried badly and never quite forgiven. You return to the village, where the priest prepares for a burial due the next day. He's meticulous, double-checking the names, the linen shroud, the placement of the stone. Not for them, he says, gesturing toward the coffin. For us, so we don't have to see them again. And you understand. This isn't superstition. It's risk management. In medieval Iceland, bury someone wrong, and you risk more than just a midnight knock on your door. You risk a ghost on the witness list. You walk now along a path where the grass is strangely lush, too green, too early for the season, and you're told, casually, that this used to be disputed land, tied up for years over a haunting. Poltergeist property, the woman guiding you mutters, as if that's a known real estate category. And here it is. Because in Iceland, where everyone knew everyone else's family history, and every acre of usable land carried stories like frost carries prints, ghost sightings could, and did, complicate property deals. You're entering the world of supernatural sabotage, where poltergeist claims weren't just frightening, they were financially weaponized. Picture this. 2 families disputing a tract of land. One side claims rights through inheritance, the other through prior ownership. It's tense. It's complicated. And then, just when one side seems poised to gain legal traction, someone sees a figure walking the edge of the land at dusk. A ghost. No one has proof, but everyone starts talking. The land becomes tainted, and suddenly, the deal falls apart. You pass a thatched roof house where, in the early 13th century, a sale was delayed for 4 years due to recurring reports of a ghost in the meadows. A white figure, the record notes, visible only in fog, walks the property line. The seller accused the buyer's family of spreading the rumor to force a lower price. The buyer denied it. The case went to court. The ruling? Ambiguous. But the land's price dropped by half. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe just effective haunting politics. This wasn't rare. Icelanders understood that fear could be leveraged. And few things frightened small, close-knit communities like land-bound spirits. Especially those tied to unsolved feuds or dishonored ancestors. Historians still argue whether these hauntings were sincere sightings or tactical inventions. One camp sees them as psychological residue, echoes of long-standing tension given ghostly shape. Others argue they were deliberate, a kind of social sabotage through folklore, exploiting belief systems to stall or manipulate legal processes. You sit with a farmer who inherited his land, with a whisper attached. He says his grandfather had to perform a public oath affirming the property was free of unrest, sworn before 3 witnesses, near the old well that was supposedly haunted. No ghost since, he shrugs. But he still keeps a charm in the eaves. In another village, you're told of a young woman who was due to inherit a field near her childhood home. But 2 nights before the legal transfer, a neighbor claimed to see her dead uncle, the previous owner, standing by the boundary stone. He didn't speak, just pointed. The land changed hands anyway, but the story lingered. The woman never built on it. It stayed quiet, she says. I didn't want to stir him. Some families took preemptive action. One document describes a cleansing clause added to a land sale, a formal statement that no spirit had claim to the property, signed by the local priest and 2 unrelated men. This wasn't religious in the Christian sense. It was a legal buffer, a paper shield against potential hauntings later being used to challenge ownership. And yes, hauntings were used to challenge inheritance. You read a case where 2 sons fought over a parcel of grazing land. The elder had the will. The younger had the ghost, who allegedly appeared to 3 different villagers, pointing away from the field. Whether that was coincidence or choreography, the court took it seriously enough to demand re-interviewing the witnesses. The elder eventually yielded a portion, just to end the spectacle. You walk beside a crumbling stone wall where someone once buried a cursed object, a brooch stolen from a woman who drowned, they say. The land was never right after. When it went up for sale, rumors flared. No one bought it for 2 generations. And when they did, it was a widow with no heirs. The land chooses its peace, the seller said cryptically. You're not sure what that means. But the price was low. Even routine property sales sometimes came with ghost disclosure traditions. One seller in a saga is recorded as saying, "The field is yours, but the shadows may not go quietly." The buyer responded, "They're welcome to work the soil if they like." That kind of grim humor was insurance through acceptance, a way of saying, "I acknowledge the story, but I won't be ruled by it." What's remarkable is how often courts played along. Not because they believed in ghosts, necessarily, but because belief was shared reality. If enough people believed a ghost lingered, and that belief affected land value, community trust, or public order, then the court had reason to mediate, regardless of spiritual certainty. You visit a law rock carved with a rune believed to keep ghosts tethered to the truth. During disputes, parties would touch the rock while giving testimony about hauntings. Not quite perjury law, but close. It's worn smooth now, but people still leave coins at its base, just in case. And then there's the curious practice of ghost walking, where sellers would walk the property line at night before a sale, reciting names of the dead and asking for signs. It wasn't mandatory, but refusing to do it raised eyebrows and dropped prices. Some buyers even insisted on it in writing. "If I see nothing, we trade," one contract reads. "If I see what you forgot, we renegotiate." As you leave the last farmhouse on the ridge, a man calls after you. If you're buying land, ask about the ones who used to dig there. You wave, pretending not to shiver. Because in Iceland, the land holds more than water and roots. It holds memory. And memory doesn't sell easily. The sky today is a pale, breathless gray, the kind that makes shadows stretch wider than they should and roofs seem slightly too low. You're walking the edge of an old boundary line, marked by a row of stones so weather-worn they look like the teeth of a long-forgotten beast. And you're not alone. A man walks ahead of you, muttering under his breath, occasionally turning to spit. "Just making sure he knows," he says without explanation. You don't ask who he is. In Iceland, the answer might very well be a ghost squatter. Yes, today you're diving into one of the strangest legal peculiarities in a place full of strange legal peculiarities. Revenants treated as squatters, unwanted tenants who refused to vacate, even if they had, inconveniently, died some years ago. Here's how it usually worked. Someone dies. They're buried, perhaps hastily, or without the full rites, or in a spot that was always a little off. Months pass, maybe years, and then something begins. Sounds in the hallway, cows refusing to enter the barn, a pale figure seen repeatedly in the same spot. Eventually, it becomes clear. The dead person hasn't left. And in Icelandic legal thought, refusal to leave had consequences. You settle beside a turf-walled sheepfold that locals insist was haunted for generations. The ghost never moaned, never threw things. He just occupied, sat on the roof at dusk, stood in doorways, lay across hay bales with a sigh that no one could trace. People stopped using the structure. Eventually, the owner took the matter to the local inn. His complaint? That the ghost's refusal to vacate was interfering with his livelihood. He didn't sue the ghost directly. But he did name the deceased, identified the site, and asked the court to recognize the haunting as a form of trespass. The result? A ritual notice was posted, a reburial was performed, and the ghost, if not evicted, was at least formally served. Historians still debate the meaning of these events. Were the courts recognizing spirits as legal actors? Not exactly. More likely, they were allowing people to frame supernatural problems in legal language, because law, unlike the ghost, had an address. And in Iceland, where disputes were meant to be resolved with logic, witnesses, and a hearty willingness to say uncomfortable things in public, even a haunting could be shaped into a property claim. You read a preserved case in a crumbling vellum scroll. It describes a man named Arni who was buried near his workshop. Years later, multiple people claimed they saw him walking into the forge at night. Tools would be found displaced, coals relit. When the new owner tried to sell the land, the hauntings scared off 2 buyers. His solution? He brought the matter before the ing. The deceased continues to occupy a working space not his to claim. The court ordered a naming right and formal expulsion, carried out by walking the perimeter of the forge and reciting Arni's genealogy backward. It worked, or at least, the sales went through. And here's the thing. Icelanders took space seriously. Land was finite. Homes were generational. A barn wasn't just a building, it was an asset, a legacy, a symbol of standing. So when someone unseen disrupted that, it was more than spooky. It was an infringement. If a ghost kept showing up in a room, it wasn't just haunting. It was occupying. There's even a saga where a man's ghost refused to leave a chair by the hearth. The family went so far as to cover the chair, block it off, and sit elsewhere. But the court took the matter further. They ordered the family to remove the chair entirely and bury it alongside the man's body, treating the item as an extension of the man's unfulfilled identity. It wasn't a spiritual banishment, it was symbolic eviction through ritual repossession. You pass a longhouse where, you're told, a guest once claimed to see a ghost warming his hands at the fire. He didn't speak, but he returned every winter, same hour, same spot. The owners sued the descendants of the ghost, arguing that their failure to maintain the grave had created an unlawful occupation. The court required the descendants to clear the hearth and burn a bundle of the ghost's old clothes. Afterward, the house was quiet. For a while. These cases may sound absurd to modern ears, but in medieval Iceland, they were a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation. People believed in order, and when that order was disturbed, by feud, famine, or phantoms, they turned to law. Even when the subject was no longer legally alive. Sometimes, the haunting itself wasn't the problem. It was the message. A ghost lingering in a room could be a sign of unfinished business, unacknowledged inheritance, or an unfulfilled promise. By treating it as a squatting issue, the court could avoid metaphysical debates and focus on what Icelanders loved most, assigning responsibility. You attend a reenactment of one such ritual. 3 elders walk the boundary of a pasture, holding staves carved with the names of the living and the dead. At the halfway point, They pause and say aloud, "You have lingered long enough. This place is not yours. Be named and be gone." The wind stirs. The sheep ignore it all. But the people nod, solemnly. Because to speak is to act. And to act is to reclaim the space. In another story, a revenant was said to sleep in a hayloft, curled like a cat on the upper beam. The farmer had to pay a neighbor to perform the eviction rite, because he himself had once owed the ghost a debt. "It's conflict of interest," he explained. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. As night falls, you sit beside a field where no one builds anymore. Too many stories. A ghost who once occupied the cottage at its center was never driven out, just ignored. The cottage fell. The land was left to grow wild. And maybe that was its own kind of settlement. Because in Iceland, even ghosts had to follow the rules. And if they didn't? Well, they got served. The hills around you are quiet, too quiet, in that specific Icelandic way that means either the sheep have wandered off or someone is about to tell a ghost story. Probably both. You're standing in a little valley that used to be farmland, until the locals collectively decided it was better left fallow. The reason? Not a drought, not a feud, but a string of eerie sightings that no one could quite explain and no one wanted to talk about too loudly. You're about to see how ghost sightings didn't just haunt individuals, they haunted entire communities, splintering trust or, just as often, binding people together in oddly bureaucratic fear. Today's lesson is this: when a ghost shows up, it never affects just one person. Especially in medieval Iceland, where isolation was relative, and everyone relied on everyone else for survival, supplies, gossip, and sheep sitting. A haunting wasn't just a spooky occurrence, it was a social event. One that could lead to meetings, disputes, alliances, and, of course, lawsuits. You pass a small circle of standing stones, worn almost flat. A nearby plaque explains that this was once a meeting site where 3 neighboring families gathered to discuss what to do about a ghost who kept appearing in the shared grazing field. No violence, no moaning. Just a woman in blue, always at twilight, always in the same spot, just watching. She never moved, she never spoke, but no one wanted to graze their animals near her, and eventually, that became a problem. The families disagreed on the cause. One claimed she was a revenant. One believed she was a memory, echoing something unresolved. The third just thought it was a trick of the fog. Unable to agree, they filed a joint claim at the local ing, not against the ghost, but as a formal request to renegotiate property access in light of a persistent spiritual presence. The court ruled that the families could rotate the grazing schedule and required that the woman's name, thought to be Gubbjord, be recited once a month during meals. That, apparently, did the trick. Or, at least, people said it did. Historians still argue whether these kinds of cases represented real spiritual belief or whether ghosts were simply the most convenient way to explain tension. Think about it. Accusing your neighbor of being a bad host or poor steward of burial rites could get ugly fast. But saying, "We've all seen something," gave you cover. It allowed the community to act together, without open accusation. You sit with a local scholar who's been compiling oral records of community hauntings. One of her favorite entries comes from a fishing village where several boats refused to leave the harbor because someone saw the ghost of a drowned boy sitting on the pier. No one wanted to say who he belonged to, or why he was back, so the villagers held a shared recitation, naming all those lost at sea in the past 10 years. After that, the sightings stopped. Or, she adds, at least they stopped talking about them. This collective action wasn't always harmonious. In one saga, a haunting nearly tore a village in half. A woman began seeing her dead brother near the oven at night. She told her neighbor. The neighbor told the priest. The priest told the lawspeaker. Soon, half the village was avoiding her, and the other half was avoiding the oven. A suit was filed, not to stop the ghost, but to determine whether the story itself constituted slander, a form of spiritual defamation that could lower someone's standing and, you guessed it, affect marriage prospects. Eventually, the court ruled that unless more than 3 unrelated people saw the ghost, it couldn't be named in a legal setting. The woman moved. The oven stayed haunted, or maybe just cold. But just as often as ghosts divided people, they also united them. One of the most curious traditions you encounter is the community haunting rite, a process where a group would collectively gather at a site of persistent disturbance and take turns telling the ghost's story. Not with fear, with respect. The idea was simple. Acknowledging a haunting together prevented it from festering in silence. You attend a modern reenactment of one such rite. A dozen people stand in a ring around a cairn, each sharing a fragment of the tale. The man who died midwinter, the son who never came home, the field that never grew right again. There's no judgment, just memory. And when the circle ends, they leave offerings: wool, bread, bits of driftwood. Not payment, just proof that they remember. In medieval Iceland, where silence could mean danger and isolation could mean death, ghosts became a mechanism for speaking the unspeakable. If grief wasn't processed, if guilt was unspoken, it would take on a shape. A figure in the doorway, a chill in the barn, a shadow at the feast. And when enough people saw it, or admitted to seeing it, then the problem could be shared. Not solved, but shared. You pass another field with a stone marker carved with a spiral. It's said that anyone who saw the ghost of the farmer's wife there had to walk the spiral path 3 times and speak a truth they'd never told. It was less about the ghost than the ritual of release. A haunting, they believed, was a mirror. You didn't get rid of it until you saw yourself in it. And so, ghost sightings became both catalyst and consequence. Not just for individual fear, but for communal reckoning. The haunting gave shape to tension. The lawsuit gave it structure. The ritual gave it end. As night closes around the hills, you hear distant bells, not church bells, but sheep bells, somewhere in the valley below. The kind of sound that marks movement, keeps rhythm, and reassures you that something out there still follows rules. And perhaps that's what the lawsuits were always about, not chasing away spirits, but reminding the living that even the unseen has boundaries. In Iceland, the dead might walk. But if they did, the living walked together. You arrive at a longhouse tucked behind a low ridge, its turf walls swollen slightly with spring damp and its doorway framed by bundles of dried herbs. The interior is warm and dark, flickering with firelight and thick with the smell of old smoke and fish oil. At the far end, a woman is reciting a story. Not for entertainment, exactly, but as part of a legal consultation. Her voice is steady, rhythmic. Every so often, she pauses, glances to the rafters, and then continues. The room is quiet. This isn't just storytelling. This is saga evidence. Today, you're exploring how medieval Icelanders treated their sagas. Those famous epic narratives filled with heroic deeds, feuds, curses, and the occasional well-dressed ghost, as more than literature. To them, sagas were precedent, and that meant they could be used, in legal cases, as a kind of oral record, especially when the issue at hand was metaphysical. Ghosts included. The Icelandic sagas weren't just stories. They were history, law, and moral compass, all stitched together with rhythm and memory. Passed down by word of mouth and eventually written onto calfskin with styluses that squeaked, they held examples of how things had been handled before, how justice had been served, or sometimes tragically missed. So when someone came forward to complain that their grandfather's ghost kept shuffling around the goat pens or whispering through the chimney, it wasn't unusual for someone in the village, often an elder or a priest, to cite a saga. Ah yes, they'd say, like the haunting of Rolfr at Velir. And just like that, a ghost story became a legal compass, guiding the next steps in real-life dispute resolution. You sit with a scholar who's compiling references to supernatural cases in the sagas. She tells you about Eyrbyggja saga, which contains one of the most famous ghost-related legal quandaries in Icelandic literature. In it, a series of strange events unfolds after a man dies and his spirit returns. First haunting, then frightening, then outright attacking villagers. Eventually, the community gathers to litigate the dead. Yes, really, they hold a formal hearing and decide to prosecute the ghosts. The haunting stops. Was this meant to be literal or allegorical? Historians still argue. Some say it's symbolic justice, a ritualized way to cope with social unrest. Others point to the structure of the saga, meticulously aligned with actual legal procedure, as evidence that people believed in the court's ability to influence the spiritual world. In either case, the saga became more than myth. It became precedent. The story was retold, referenced, and used as justification in later hauntings. This is like Eyrbyggja, someone might say at a ing. We must respond accordingly. Another saga, Laxdæla, features a woman named Guðrun who dreams of dead men speaking to her, giving her insight into hidden wrongs. The dream is interpreted not as madness, but as evidence. A priest declares it relevant. The community listens. In the context of Icelandic law, dreams, if told convincingly, could tip the scales. Especially if they matched established saga patterns. You ask a local priest whether he's ever seen someone cite a saga in a real complaint. He nods slowly, not formally, but they say things like, "It happened before," to people better than me. And everyone understands what that means. There's a legal theory in Icelandic thought, minnistraust, which roughly translates to memory trust. It means that stories told often enough, and remembered accurately enough, can guide action even in the absence of written law. And when the law faces something it can't quite explain, like a ghost, it reaches for memory. You find a carved slate propped against a longhouse wall. On it is a sketch, rudimentary, but clear, of a man lying in a bed, with what appears to be a shadowy figure sitting on his chest. Beneath it are 3 runic characters and a short inscription. See the tale of Eyvindur and the restless sleep. That's not a law, it's a narrative citation. In one remarkable case, a woman defended herself against accusations of improper burial by citing a saga in which a similar ghost refused to rest until a lock of hair had been placed in his coffin. "I did the same," she told the court. "If he walks now, it's not because of me." No further complaints were made. Sometimes, referencing the right story was as good as producing a witness. Even children learn these ghost law overlaps. You hear a lullaby whispered by an elder to a dozing toddler. It contains the story of a boy who fed a ghost bread 3 nights in a row and was rewarded with calm winds and full sheepfolds. That's a real case, she tells you. Or close enough. And close enough, in Iceland, was often sufficient for guidance. This interplay between story and statute wasn't chaos. It was organic case law. If a haunting reminded people of a saga, and that saga had a known resolution, the community could adopt a similar strategy. It was a kind of spiritual common law, built from narrative patterns and reinforced through ritual and retelling. You watch a small group reenact a saga passage by the fire. One plays the ghost, another the farmer, and a third the lawspeaker. They act it out not for fun, but to rehearse what might happen tomorrow, when a real complaint will be heard at the next gathering. It's legal theater, and also legal prep. Because in medieval Iceland, sagas were living documents. They taught how to fight, farm, marry, and how to handle hauntings. And if a ghost shows up tonight, you won't panic. You'll recite the tale. You'll remember what happened to Rolfur. And you'll follow the precedent. The ground here is dark and spongy, stitched with the footprints of sheep and the deeper grooves of wagon wheels long vanished into mist. You follow a winding trail up toward a windswept plateau, where the land levels into a series of flat stones arranged almost like benches. A man waits there, one leg folded beneath him, carving notches into a stick. "It's for balance," he says. 3 notches for the living, 1 for the dead. Then he tells you the story of a priest, a farmer, and a phantom cow. And you realize you've stumbled into one of the strangest and best documented ghost lawsuits in Icelandic legal memory. This was no vague moaning in the wind kind of case. This was specific. The cow had a name. The ghost had a motive. And the lawsuit, believe it or not, involved both clergy testimony and a formal pasture inspection. It began like many of these tales do. with milk gone sour and blame drifting toward the shadows. The farmer, John, claimed his best cow, Freya, had stopped producing milk and began acting oddly, bellowing toward empty corners, bolting from her pen, and once even collapsing in terror at the sound of a flute. John believed the cow was being harassed by his late uncle, Christlifer, who had once raised livestock on the same land. Christlifer had died under odd circumstances. Some whispered it was poisoning, others said a fall. But either way, the burial was rushed. No name was spoken, no priest in attendance. John took this seriously, because in Iceland, as you now well know, failures in burial rites could lead to legal consequences, especially if the consequences were visible and moving. He brought his complaint before the local priest, who did not immediately dismiss it. Instead, he performed an evening rite near the barn, observed Freya's behavior, and, this is recorded, claimed he felt a great coldness and the presence of a will not wholly resigned. The phrase was enough to open the gates to legal action. John filed a formal claim of spiritual interference resulting in property damage, naming the deceased Christlifer, but directing the legal complaint toward his still-living brother, Christlifer's executor and burial steward. The claim centered not on the ghost itself, but on the brother's failure to ensure a peaceful rest, which had, allegedly, resulted in the haunting and the cow's declining health. Historians still argue whether the priest's involvement was based in belief or diplomacy. Regardless, his testimony at the local inn was clear. The cow had been disturbed. And that disturbance was, in the view of the court, a communal issue. You pass a patch of grass where John's barn once stood. Nothing remains but the outline of a foundation and a stone marker bearing the faint shape of a cross. According to local tradition, this is where the priest stood when he declared, "No cow shall be judged mad for seeing what others will not." That line made it into the court record. The judgment? A remarkable example of Icelandic compromise. The brother of the deceased was ordered to perform a naming rite at the burial site, place one of Christlifer's old tools beside the grave, and publicly acknowledge his failure to fulfill proper rites. John was compensated with a small portion of hay and 2 pints of preserved milk, symbolic restitution for the dairy his cow had lost. The cow, for her part, recovered. Whether this was due to the ritual, the season, or simple coincidence, no one knows. But she lived another 3 years, and the story became a legend told in both legal and livestock circles. You laugh, but then you read through similar records. A young man in Vamur who blamed his uncle's ghost for grain spoilage. A widow in Husavik whose chickens refused to roost until her late husband's axe was removed from the rafters. And always, these cases were resolved not by denying the ghost, but by acknowledging something had been left undone. In John's case, it wasn't just about the cow. It was about Christlifer's death being swept aside, about a family neglecting the steps meant to ensure dignity, peace, and legal closure. The haunting forced the issue. The lawsuit made it real. And in Iceland, that reality mattered. Because once the claim was formal, once the story had been heard, it could be processed, indexed, given outcome, and that, more than any prayer or charm, gave people a path forward. You pass through a grove where it's said people used to bring small objects tied to hauntings, buttons, bones, bits of cloth, and leave them under the trees. One tag remains, faded with time, tied to a rusted bell, for the goat who saw the ghost. No further explanation. You find that enough. Because in a land of sparse resources and stubborn weather, it wasn't enough to endure the strange. You had to make it legible. And that's what the lawsuits did. They offered a vocabulary for fear, a format for grief, a way to say, I don't know what happened, but I know it matters. And sometimes it was about a cow. And sometimes that was reason enough. The rain is coming sideways now, the kind that feels like it's trying to remind you just how little you control in this world. You duck beneath the eave of a turf-roofed meeting hall, its walls mossy, its doorway barely taller than your shoulders. Inside, there's warmth and a hush of anticipation, the low murmur of people preparing not for judgment, but for performance. Tonight, you're here to witness something distinctly Icelandic, a lawsuit as social theater. Because here's the thing, not every ghost complaint was filed out of terror. Some were filed for reasons far more human: reputation, leverage, spectacle. In a land where every tale became part of a saga and every slight might echo for generations, suing a ghost could be less about the haunting and more about who was watching when you told the story. You settle onto a bench near the back as the law speaker stands and calls out the names involved in the case. It's a reenactment, but based on a real historical dispute, preserved in the notes of a 14th-century priest. A woman named Ragna claimed that her dead mother-in-law had returned nightly to observe the cleanliness of her hearth and comment with great disapproval. The ghost never touched anything, never caused damage, she simply loomed. Ragna filed a complaint, not because she feared harm, but because she was tired of the judgment, even from beyond the grave. Her suit named her brother-in-law as responsible for the improper burial, but her testimony focused entirely on the social strain. Her neighbors had begun whispering that she must have done something to deserve the visits. The court, caught between superstition and sarcasm, ruled that the grave should be blessed again and that Ragna should receive a public affirmation of her character from her husband and the local priest. Historians still debate how serious this case was. Some see it as a farce, a dramatized airing of family grievances. Others note that the format, formal complaint, witness testimony, remedy, was no different than any other legal procedure of the time. In Iceland, the line between law and story was always a little fuzzy. But it worked. You watch as the actors playing the villagers deliver their lines, grim, poetic, oddly tender. One stands and says, "A ghost is only noise until the living give it words." The crowd murmurs. Someone chuckles. Someone else nods slowly, like they've heard that exact line before, perhaps in real court, long ago. In a nearby town, a man once filed a claim that his deceased cousin was haunting the local sauna by slamming the door at unpredictable hours. When questioned, he admitted that no one else had witnessed it, but insisted that the haunting was symbolic of unresolved envy between us. The court dismissed the case, but not before letting him deliver a full speech about the injustice of their final argument. The speech was later copied into a saga fragment, because it was that compelling. This is what ghost lawsuits often became: ritualized confession disguised as accusation. The ghost gave you permission to speak about things normally left buried. In some cases, it gave you a chance to shape the narrative of a death, a feud, or a shame that might otherwise fester. You speak with an elderly saga keeper who explains that for many families, haunting tales became a kind of cathartic currency. A way to say, "We have not forgotten." Or more subtly, "We were wronged, but we survived." One of her favorite stories involves a man who claimed his brother's ghost would not stop appearing in dreams to complain about a missed inheritance. The court ruled that there was no legal standing, but the man's sons still left a pouch of coins at the grave. Just to be thorough, they said. In another saga, a woman weaponized a ghost sighting to delay a marriage. She claimed her late husband was appearing by the fjord, watching her suitor disapprovingly. The delay bought her family enough time to renegotiate the dowry. When the ghost mysteriously stopped appearing, no one asked too many questions. And yes, sometimes the motive was nothing more than attention. Iceland's legal proceedings were public. They drew crowds. They created stories. If you wanted your voice heard, if you wanted to shape the tale that would be told when the winter nights grew long and everyone gathered to recite memories, you might just tell the court your hayloft was haunted. Not every ghost was real, but every performance had meaning. You walk through a village where, long ago, a well-known poet filed a claim that the ghost of a rival had been visiting him each night, whispering lines of verse and criticizing his metaphors. The court didn't pursue the case, but the poet published a poem the next spring titled, "Complaint of the Silent Tongue." It became a regional favorite. The real power in these cases wasn't the verdict. It was the opportunity to shape the narrative. Icelanders lived in a culture where honor and reputation were as real as property lines. To be haunted wasn't just about fear, it was about visibility. A haunting drew attention. A lawsuit drew structure. You pause at the edge of the meeting hall. A child is acting out a miniature trial with pebbles and carved sheep. One sheep refuses to enter the barn. The others gather. A witness testifies. The shadow said her name. The judge, another sheep, nods gravely and declares the matter settled with a stone offering. It's ridiculous. It's brilliant. It's exactly how the system worked. Because in Iceland, suing a ghost didn't always mean you believed in ghosts. It meant you believed in story as resolution. And sometimes, the courtroom was the only stage big enough to hold what your heart needed to say. The wind combs through the valley as if searching for something forgotten, lifting threads of smoke from scattered hearts and carrying with it the hush of conversations just ended. You sit beside a cairn near the remains of an old assembly site, its stones rounded by centuries of wind, rain, and footsteps. This is where judgments were once spoken aloud, not etched into parchment, but into memory. And tonight, You're thinking about how ghost trials created precedents, and how those precedents shaped Iceland's strange, spectral relationship with justice. Because here's the truth. In Iceland, if something happened more than once, it became a pattern. And if that pattern was remembered well enough, it became a precedent, a guidepost for how to act when the dead came knocking, or muttering, or dragging your furniture across the floor at 2 a.m. You're told about an early case, the haunting of a woman named Aldis, whose ghost kept appearing in the dreams of her neighbors, weeping and pointing toward a lake. The dreams were dismissed as sorrow-induced until a fisherman spotted her figure one morning on the lake's edge, silently mouthing words he couldn't hear. This was enough to reopen the conversation. The priest ordered a communal ritual. The Ing ruled that her grave needed to be shifted slightly uphill. It was done. The dreams stopped, and most importantly, the case was remembered. From then on, when ghost dreams surfaced, people referenced the case of Aldis. Her haunting became not just a story, but a touchstone. It gave future communities a framework. What signs mattered, how many witnesses were enough, and what actions might restore peace. In this way, ghost trials weren't just about resolution. They were about template making. Historians still debate how intentional this precedent building was. Did medieval Icelanders consciously model their decisions after earlier ghost cases? Or did they simply carry forward the shape of the response, like a melody passed down without lyrics, familiar even when half forgotten? You flip through a collection of transcribed court records and find recurring phrasing, as with the Revenant of Skagafjörður. In the manner of the haunt at Snæfell, it's subtle, but it's there. Legal memory invoked through ghost stories, treated seriously enough to influence modern burial practices, property rituals, and even the phrasing of some Christian prayers. One haunting in particular stands out. A ghost who returned repeatedly to the threshold of his daughter's home, refusing to enter, refusing to leave. Eventually, the community ruled that a public apology must be made on his behalf. It worked. The story became famous, and from then on, any ghost reported lingering near thresholds was understood to represent unresolved kinship shame. That pattern stuck, shaping both belief and procedure. You visit a village where the local priest still begins every burial service with a spoken remembrance of 3 specific hauntings, and the remedies that resolved them. It's not doctrine, he tells you. It's guidance, like a shadow in the road that tells you to walk slower. In another region, you hear of a field that remained unused for decades after a haunting, even though the spirit had been formally addressed. Why? Because the land had become a cautionary tale. Children were taught to recite the events. Couples walked past it in silence. Its memory became a kind of legal folklore, a reminder of what happens when rights are neglected. This isn't just superstition. It's communal consensus over time, shaped and reinforced by repeated storytelling and carefully remembered solutions. Even skeptical Icelanders used these stories as frameworks. "I don't believe in ghosts," one herdsman says, "but I believe in doing what worked for my grandfather." You sit with a woman whose family keeps a hand-copied record of hauntings and their resolutions. We call it the second law book, she says with a smile. It contains no statutes, only cases. How to name a ghost. How to return a misplaced object. How many witnesses to require before filing a complaint. We don't use it often, she says, but we never forget it's there. The most fascinating part? These precedents evolved. Early ghost trials emphasized ritual, reburials, naming, symbolic acts. Later cases leaned more on community consensus, votes, declarations, negotiations. Some even involved material compensation, where the aggrieved party received livestock or grain in exchange for peace rites performed on someone else's behalf. And each shift left a trail, a reference, a pattern. Even false hauntings could establish precedent. In one village, a woman fabricated a ghost story to cover for her son's theft. When the truth came out, she was fined, but her case became the basis for a new standard. Ghost complaints must be supported by two unrelated testimonies or physical evidence of spiritual disruption. Think cold spots, broken charms, animals refusing to enter specific rooms. That rule echoed in 3 later cases, including one involving a haunted sauna and a mysteriously relocated axe. And it's not just rural communities that remember these. Saga schools still teach students about the codified ghost logic of Erbygja, Laxdæla, and Floamanna. Legal scholars have written dissertations on how the structure of haunting tales mirrors trial proceedings, using ghosts to dramatize the process of communal judgment. You visit a stonemason who, decades ago, carved a small face into the edge of a burial stone at his wife's request. She'd heard of a ghost whose peace had only come when his likeness was acknowledged. I didn't believe it, he says, but I knew what happened in the old cases. He gestures toward the stone. No visits. Because sometimes, precedent doesn't just settle a case. It settles a spirit. And in Iceland, where the law once echoed through valleys like song, that echo grew deep enough to guide the living and the dead alike. You step into a dimly lit archive tucked behind a chapel, where dried fish hang from the rafters and the musty scent of vellum seeps into your nose like old dust made heavier by memory. A young scholar is sorting through folios wrapped in lambskin, each one etched with script so careful, so densely curled, it looks less like handwriting and more like someone whispering in ink. He looks up as you enter and says, "You're here for the ghosts, aren't you?" You nod. "Good," he says, "because not all ghosts are created equal." Today you're digging into the subtle but telling difference between legal ghosts, those acknowledged by law and used in courts, and literary ghosts, the more flamboyant, saga haunting, poetry stalking revenants that thrived in Icelandic tales. And how, curiously, these two species of spirit didn't always get along. See, in Iceland, stories were functional. They taught, they warned, they remembered. But not all stories made it into the legal record. And not all ghosts made good witnesses. While legal ghosts were bound by ritual, responsibility, and response, their literary cousins were theatrical, prone to drama, vengeance, and long, brooding speeches that probably wouldn't hold up in court. You flip through a saga passage describing a ghost who rises from the sea each midsummer to demand that his bones be returned to the churchyard. He has a voice like thunder. He curses a priest. He curses the moon. He's terrifying, and clearly a metaphor. No one sues anyone. There's no burial correction. Just horror, then silence. That's a literary ghost. Now compare that with a dry court document from 1247. A man files a complaint that a deceased relative is appearing by the sheep pen and disturbing the dogs. He names the deceased, provides witnesses, requests a burial amendment. There's no cursing, no moon, just an orderly account of a problem, a claim, and a proposed remedy. That's a legal ghost. Historians still argue whether these categories reflected separate beliefs or just different modes of expression. Were legal ghosts considered more real, or were they simply more manageable, less supernatural horror, more civic nuisance? The scholar smiles as he lays out a side-by-side comparison for you. One tale from Grettis Saga, where the titular hero wrestles a draugr in a burial mound, and one court record of a woman who asked for compensation after seeing her father's ghost standing in her dairy room for 3 nights. The first ends in swordplay. The second in a reburial and 3 barrels of salted fish. The literary ghost, the scholar explains, is unpredictable, powerful, meant to awe or frighten. The legal ghost just wants something fixed. And once it's fixed, it goes away. And that's a crucial point. Legal ghosts always came with a solution. They weren't endless nightmares. They were disputes that could be resolved. Burial in sacred ground, ritual naming, property acknowledgement, an apology, a goat. Literary ghosts, by contrast, were open loops, dramatized versions of trauma and guilt. They reflected the anxieties of exile, broken oaths, unresolved feuds. They couldn't be silenced with a naming right. They existed to unsettle, not to conclude. And yet, there was crossover. Some ghost complaints borrowed language from sagas, invoking scenes of groaning spirits, weeping revenants, or shadowy figures standing in the doorway. In some cases, too much literary flair actually undermined a claim. One record shows a judge chastising a complainant for decorative testimony, suggesting she had borrowed too heavily from the sagas to bolster her story. You need the ghost to be believable, the scholar says. Not poetic, just disruptive enough to require a solution, but not so dramatic that it stops sounding like real life. This delicate balance shaped Icelandic ghost lore for generations. People learned to distinguish between the ghosts of drama and the ghosts of dispute. One gave you chills, the other gave you chores. You sit in on a reading where students are comparing saga excerpts with real-life ghost complaints. One passage describes a spirit who pulls the thatch from roofs and laughs in the night. The other, a woman reports hearing knocking 3 nights in a row, tied to her grandfather's unfulfilled death oath. Which ghost gets sued? The teacher asks. The class answers in unison. The one with the unfinished oath. That's how it worked. For all the theatrical glory of Icelandic sagas, Real communities preferred resolvable hauntings. Ghosts that could be negotiated with, not battled. You pass a roadside marker where a ghost was once said to walk at dusk, carrying his own head and muttering in tongues. The saga version is terrifying. But in town, you find a much quieter record. Disturbance near road attributed to improper funeral pacing. Corrected through naming right and 3-night vigil. In other words, problem handled. What's striking is how the Icelandic people preserved both kinds of ghost. They didn't deny the dramatic tales, but they compartmentalized them. They knew when a ghost was meant to frighten, and when it was meant to be filed. And maybe that's the most Icelandic thing of all. Not the belief in ghosts, but the belief that even ghosts must be told. This is your story. This is your lane. One for the saga. One for the law. And, occasionally, one for both. The road is narrower today, rutted with tracks of hooves and wheels long gone. You follow it past a row of withered birches, their bark peeling like old paper, and beyond them, a low house half sunk into the hillside, its roof patchy with moss, its windows covered with cloth. That one, your guide says softly, belonged to a man who didn't believe. Not in ghosts, not in hauntings, not in anything he couldn't touch or measure or fence in with stone. And for that, in this particular tale, he found himself dragged into one of the strangest legal entanglements in Icelandic memory. A ghost trial without a believer. The man's name was Kolbeinn, and he was known locally for scoffing at every tale of revenants, specters, and moaning shadows in the woods. He thought hauntings were excuses, fabrications invented by people too cowardly to admit their failures. If a barn door slammed in the wind, someone hadn't latched it. If the cows refused to enter, the feed was bad. No ghost could explain what incompetence already had. But Kolbeinn's skepticism didn't protect him. Because one winter, a boy claimed to see Kolbeinn's deceased father, long dead, properly buried, mourned and sung over, sitting by the hearth at dusk. At first, Kolbeinn laughed it off. Let him haunt, he said. He was never much company alive. But then more people began to speak. A neighbor claimed to see the same figure at the well. A woman reported hearing his name whispered behind her house. The sightings were consistent, unnervingly so. And still, Kolbeinn refused to act. So the community sued him. That's right. In a reversal of the usual formula, Kolbeinn wasn't the plaintiff, he was the defendant. His refusal to perform the necessary rites, to publicly acknowledge the alleged haunting, to even entertain the possibility that something was wrong, was seen not as rationality, but as negligence. Historians still debate the implications of this case. Was it about belief at all? Or was it about social responsibility? The idea that when enough people share an experience, denial becomes a kind of offense in itself. Icelandic law, after all, was communal at its core. If your actions or inaction unsettled others, it could be grounds for legal consequence. And in a world where ghosts meant unresolved issues, ignoring them risked tearing at the fragile fabric of village trust. The case proceeded like any other. Witnesses were called, testimonies given. One woman, whose sheep refused to cross Colbian's land after the ghost was sighted, provided a tearful account of a chill she couldn't explain. A boy recited a half-remembered lullaby the ghost allegedly whispered in his dreams, the same one Colbian's father used to sing. And Colbian? He stood silent, arms crossed, refusing to participate beyond the barest procedural minimum. You sit in the echo of that old house, the wind whistling through its collapsed chimney, and think about the verdict. The court did not declare the ghost real. It didn't have to. Instead, it ruled that Colbian had failed to maintain community peace. His refusal to perform the rites caused harm, not to the ghost, but to his neighbors. He was fined a small flock of sheep and ordered to stand at his father's grave and speak a formal acknowledgement. I release you. I remember you. Be at peace. He did so, under protest. The sightings stopped, or at least, the stories did. You ask a local if the ghost was ever real. He shrugs. Colbian believed in walls. We believed in cold air and footsteps. Either way, he owed us peace. This was not the only case like it. In another, a woman dismissed her neighbor's complaints that her dead mother was visiting the bakehouse, moving the pans and adjusting the embers. She called it coincidence. The priest called it patterned behavior. Eventually, under pressure, she allowed a naming right. It's not belief, she said at the time. It's politics. You pass through a small settlement where a ritual stone has been reinstalled after decades. The villagers say no one believes in the ghost who once walked here, but everyone believes in not talking about her too much. That, too, is a form of acknowledgement. And this is what you begin to understand. Icelandic ghost trials were never about proving belief. They were about managing belief. The question wasn't, do you believe in ghosts? It was, do you respect what belief means to those around you? And if enough people said the wind carried a name, or that the barn creaked in grief, then law stepped in, not to argue theology, but to preserve cohesion. Even skeptics learned to play their part. A man named Stin, known for mockery and dry wit, once hosted a naming right just to silence gossip about his allegedly haunted pantry. He did it with a smirk, but he did it. And after, he joked, even ghosts prefer certainty. So if you're standing in a village where a haunting is whispered, and you're tempted to laugh, think carefully. In Iceland, the law didn't require belief. It required participation. And sometimes, acknowledging a ghost had nothing to do with fear. It had to do with belonging. You wake to the soft, persistent patter of snow, too light to hush the world completely, but just enough to make everything feel vaguely forgotten. Outside, the roofs are white-capped and the hills smudged into one long, slow curve. You pull your cloak tighter as you make your way down a slope toward a scattered set of farms, each one tilted slightly by time. Today, you've come to a village remembered not for a haunting, but for what happened after the ghost was gone. Because sometimes, resolving the ghost was only half the story. Sometimes the repercussions of a haunting lasted longer than the haunting itself, echoing through families, property lines, inheritance disputes, and, most tellingly, the law. This particular village dealt with a ghost that appeared for only 5 nights. Just 5, but in those 5 nights, she managed to sow a decade's worth of lawsuits. The story, passed down in tones part reverent and part exasperated, is now known locally as the Widow's Loop. It began, as many things did in Iceland, with a poorly handled burial. A woman named Orni died during childbirth and was interred in the family plot without a priest. Stormy weather had delayed his arrival, and the rites were never performed. Within days, her sister-in-law began hearing weeping at night. A child claimed to see a woman by the fire, brushing her hair with no hands. A hired farmhand quit after hearing humming in the rafters. The family, embarrassed but alarmed, performed a naming ritual. It seemed to work. The sightings stopped. But the story did not. Because as word of the haunting spread, questions were raised about Orni's will, specifically, a clause stating that her dowry land should pass to her son upon marriage. Now, the son was still an infant, but Orni's brother-in-law claimed that the haunting proved a spiritual unease, and used this as justification to challenge the clause's legality. His argument? That if the deceased had truly been at peace, she wouldn't have returned. Historians still argue about the logic of this claim, which, on paper, reads as somewhere between speculative theology and rural legal opportunism. But it worked. A local priest, perhaps eager to avoid further ghost talk, supported the challenge. The court reopened the case. And just like that, a single haunting unraveled a legally binding will. This wasn't a one-time occurrence. Throughout medieval Iceland, ghost sightings occasionally triggered re-examinations of earthly affairs, especially inheritance. Some were genuine. A haunting reminded someone of an unpaid debt, a misfiled deed, a promise broken. Others were strategic. You walk past a field that once belonged to a woman who died childless. Her cousin claimed she'd promised him the plot. Others disagreed. When he saw her ghost walking the border of the field at dusk, he interpreted it as a sign of unfinished legal business. He filed a claim. The court did not affirm the haunting, but they did reopen the case, citing community unrest. The cousin got half the field. It's easy to scoff, but in a culture that prized oral history, collective memory, and subtle, ritual-based justice, a haunting was a valid catalyst for legal review. The ghost didn't decide the case. It simply reopened the door. You pass a farmstead where an old woman sits by the fire, stirring something thick and sweet-smelling. The haunting's gone, she says, but the lawsuits still walk. Her grandson had tried to sell a parcel of land tied to a century-old ghost story. No one would buy it until the family held a formal vigil. Not because they feared the ghost, but because they feared being named in a future case. This is the curious ripple of ghost trials. They created cautionary legacies. Once your property, your family, or your name became linked to the undead, even briefly, it tended to linger in the legal imagination. Buyers hesitated, matches broke off, partnerships soured. One law code fragment refers to this as spiritual residuality, a phrase that sounds delightfully bureaucratic, for people still talk about that haunted barn. In practice, it meant that past hauntings affected future legal credibility. In one saga, a man trying to defend himself in court is dismissed out of hand. This from the one whose mother couldn't stay buried. A ghost in your past was a mark you couldn't easily scrub clean. It cast a shadow not just over your property, but your trustworthiness. And so, families began developing what might generously be called post-ghost protocols. These included public declarations of peace rights, community acknowledgments, even symbolic offerings on anniversaries, just to remind people that yes, the haunting had been addressed, and no, there was no reason to revisit the matter in court. You watch a ceremony where 3 generations gather to pour milk on a stone, marking the day their ancestor stopped appearing by the gate. The milk isn't for her. It's for the village, a public reminder that the family has done its due diligence, that there is no further legal claim to be made. And in Iceland, where memories last longer than fences, that kind of reassurance matters. You sit by the river where Orni's ashes were scattered after her body was finally moved, decades after the original haunting. The land has long since passed into other hands. But each spring, someone still leaves a plaited braid of dried grass on the bank. No one knows who, no one questions it. Because in Iceland, when a ghost is gone, the echo isn't silence. It's precedent. And precedent has weight. The air tastes different this morning, brighter, somehow, like snowmelt and old wood smoke. You follow the smell of baking bread past rows of low-set turf homes until you reach a square where the ground has been recently cleared. There's a stone set into the earth, unmarked except for a faint groove running across its surface. This is where, long ago, a ghost was summoned, not to be driven out, but to testify. Yes, today you're wading into the strangest, most theatrical corner of Iceland's ghost law history, the rare but unforgettable phenomenon of spectral testimony. Because once in a while, in the borderland between belief and bureaucracy, someone would claim that the dead not only returned, but spoke with purpose. And if they spoke with purpose, well, Icelanders listened. The story you hear is one of the most documented. It begins with a dispute over a broken promise, a betrothal agreement between 2 families that crumbled when one party died unexpectedly. The woman, Brynhildr, had been promised to a farmer's son, but her father denied the engagement after her death, claiming there'd been no oath, no formal token exchanged. The farmer's family disagreed, and then, so did Brynhildr. Or rather, the ghost of Brynhildr. 3 nights in a row, she was seen by members of both families. Each time, she stood silently, near the stone where the original agreement was said to have been made. Finally, the mother of the farmer's son declared that Brynhildr had spoken to her, confirming the agreement and insisting that she had died bound by a promise never fulfilled. Now, of course, ghosts don't have legal standing in Icelandic law. But oaths do, and an oath, once spoken aloud by multiple witnesses, even if quoted from beyond the grave, had to be taken seriously. Historians still argue whether these ghost testimonies were believed literally or accepted symbolically. Was the community agreeing to the spirit's version of events, or simply responding to the weight of grief, ritual, and social expectation? Either way, the result was the same. The agreement was upheld. Brynhilder's family was ordered to provide the dowry. The matter was settled. But the ghost stories didn't stop. You read another account, this one from the margins of a church record. A man accused of theft claimed that his dead wife had appeared to him in a dream and named the true thief. She came to me with cold hands and said, "He took what was yours." The court didn't rule on the dream, but it did investigate the accused, who later confessed. Coincidence? Maybe, but the dream had been recorded in the legal summary as the initial catalyst for justice. Another tale tells of a man who, after refusing to repay a debt to his dead brother's family, was visited by the ghost of the brother himself, who allegedly pointed to a box beneath the floorboards and said, "The payment is still owed." When the box was uncovered, it contained a token of the loan. The man relented. The family filed no lawsuit. They didn't need to. You attend a reenactment in a hillside hall where two women perform a trial scene based on a real historical case, one playing a witness, the other the voice of a ghost speaking through dream. The performance is calm, solemn, slow. Every line is given time to breathe. And when it ends, no one claps. They simply sit with it, because that's what ghost testimony does. It lingers. You ask one of the performers how she feels about ghosts. She says, "They tell the truths we're afraid to admit, but we still write them down." And that's what makes these cases so strange and so human. Ghosts were never treated as legal citizens. But their words, if delivered through a trusted witness, could be weighed like any other evidence. Icelanders didn't need to believe a ghost had spoken. They only needed to believe that what was spoken deserved to be heard. You walk past a house where a carved panel still hangs by the doorway. It reads, "He returned to tell us what we already knew." The owner says it refers to an uncle whose ghost, they say, kept muttering about a lost inheritance. "We hadn't wanted to split the land," she admits. "But after that, we did. Not because they feared the ghost, but because the truth had been said aloud, and once said, it couldn't be taken back." Even today, echoes of spectral testimony linger in how Icelandic families resolve disputes. A farmer tells you his father once dreamed of a lost cousin, who told him which field to use for planting. The crops were good that year, he says with a shrug. Better than arguing. You stop at a small cairn by the river, built with 5 stones, one for each sibling in a family once divided by a ghost's complaint. They reconciled, the guide explains. They never agreed whether she really spoke, but they agreed she needed to be answered. And that's the truth beneath all of this. In Iceland, the dead weren't expected to shout, scream, or rattle chains. They only needed to say enough. Just enough to stir memory. Just enough to prompt justice. Just enough to be heard, even once. And when they were, that was usually all they asked for. The trail you're on now winds beside a frozen lake, its surface glassy, almost too smooth, as if no creature dares to cross it. The locals don't skate here. They don't fish here, even when the ice is thick and the fish, they say, leap to be caught. You ask why, and someone answers, because of the whisperer. Then they change the subject. It's time to talk about places that become ghosts. In Icelandic thought, the dead don't always stay tethered to a body. Sometimes, they embed themselves into locations, lingering in the land, the buildings, even the weather. And when they do, the haunting isn't a person. It's a presence. And like everything else, that presence, if disruptive enough, can be named, addressed, and, yes, even sued. You're not dealing with moaning phantoms or shadowy forms anymore. These hauntings are subtle, a cold patch in a doorway that never warms, a loft where bread won't rise, a field where tools go missing, again and again. At first, these feel like quirks. Then they become patterns, and eventually, someone says aloud, "It's not the person. It's the place." That's when the legal gears begin to turn. One of the most well-known of these cases involved a small church on a hillside known as Ronald. The site had been used for generations, but during a particularly harsh winter, strange things began to happen. Candles that wouldn't light, children refusing to enter, even animals going still outside the door. When a priest fell ill and claimed to see a dark mist leaning against the altar, the congregation filed a formal complaint, not against the ghost, but against the landholder responsible for maintaining the site. Their argument? That the land was spiritually contaminated, and the owner had failed to perform the necessary rituals when rebuilding the church after a lightning strike 3 years prior. The court didn't rule on the haunting's legitimacy, but it did recognize the responsibility of care, ordering the landholder to consecrate the site and publicly restore its spiritual standing. Historians still debate what spiritual standing means in legal terms. Some interpret it as a symbolic act, like repainting a cursed room. Others believe these rulings reflect a deeper cultural understanding, that space itself could carry moral weight. And when space became uncomfortable, it required intervention. You visit a collapsed cottage said to be haunted with sadness. No shadows, no cold drafts. Just an overwhelming reluctance to stay inside. 3 tenants left in 1 season. The 4th moved in with a goat and claimed it helped. The sadness didn't mind the goat, he said. But after a year, he too left. The land was eventually purchased at a discount, with a clause absolving the seller of spiritual liability. That clause? It still exists in modern Icelandic real estate paperwork. Rare, but real. You pass a blackened patch of earth where a barn once stood. The barn was haunted by silence, complete silence. No sound of hoof or voice ever echoed properly inside. It unsettled people. Eventually, someone filed a complaint, not to demand action, but to have the haunting formally recognized so the land could be reassigned for different use. The court agreed. The building was dismantled. the foundation left untouched. It's not always about fear. Sometimes it's about utility. If a place resists habitation, it becomes a problem. If the problem is big enough, the community responds. And in Iceland, the method of response, legal framing of the unexplainable, is a kind of cultural muscle memory. You visit a school where children are taught to recognize the signs of a haunted space. Repeated dreams, unnatural stillness, livestock discomfort, unexplained decay. Not because they're expected to believe, necessarily, but because these signs have been used historically to trigger action. Action that's legally documented, action that becomes precedent. In another case, a sheepfold was moved stone by stone because the corner post would not stay standing. Multiple replacements snapped. The court ruled it a case of structural anomaly, but the record includes testimony from a man who claimed the post fell only when a particular name was spoken nearby. Coincidence, the court said, but they still moved the fold. And sometimes, places are left alone altogether. You come to a glen known as Vamaalugrand, the listening ground. No one builds there, no one plants. It's beautiful, rich soil, perfect sun, but it's said that if you speak aloud, your own words return to you, slightly altered. Like they've been considered, a girl tells you. The land is listed as ceremonial use only. There is no law forbidding construction, but no one would try. Even here, the land holds memory, and if that memory disturbs the present, Icelanders respond with law, not denial. They make space for discomfort. They write it down. They give it shape. That shape might be a document, a rite, or a stone with no inscription, but it is enough. You watch as a local council considers what to do about a collapsing storehouse said to be resisting repair. The beams twist. The mortar won't hold. They decide, calmly, to rebuild 10 paces to the left. We'll leave the ghost its corner, someone jokes. But they mean it. Because in Iceland, ghosts don't always knock or wail. Sometimes they just settle into the land. And when they do, the people move around them, carefully, respectfully. Not out of fear, but out of memory. Out of the knowledge that some places never really let go. You arrive at a hilltop where the wind never seems to rest, and even the sheep avoid lingering too long. There's no building here, no cairn or cross, just a ring of stones pressed flat into the turf. Your guide stops beside it and says, "This is where the forgetting failed." Because today, you're exploring what happens when a haunting isn't resolved. When the rituals are skipped. When the lawsuit is never filed. When the community chooses silence instead of response, and the ghost, instead of leaving, simply lingers. This is the domain of the unprocessed haunting, and it was feared more than any single ghost. Not because it was violent, but because it never stopped. In Icelandic thought, forgetting wasn't just a lapse in memory. It was a failure of duty. The dead, especially the troubled or wronged, were owed not only burial, but story, ritual, and response. When that didn't happen, when a revenant's needs went unacknowledged, the result was believed to be a kind of cultural infection. The ghost became rooted in place and legend, showing up again and again, generation after generation. You hear the tale of Ingimundur, a merchant who drowned under mysterious circumstances during a sea voyage. His body was never recovered, and no rites were performed. Within a year, reports began. His shape seen walking the shore, his voice calling out during storms. A lawsuit was filed. Against no one in particular, just a declaration of grief. It was dismissed. Too vague. Too late. But the sightings never ceased. Ingimundur's story became a kind of background hum in the village's oral history. When fish stocks declined, people mentioned his name. When sails tore mid-journey, they said, "He still waits." His ghost became a metaphor, but also more than that. A reminder of a failure to act. A caution. A lesson. Historians still argue whether the persistence of these unresolved hauntings was cultural self-punishment or a clever method of preserving memory. Some claim the stories were shaped over time to maintain communal cohesion, offering an ever-present symbol of the consequences of neglect. Others believe they represent genuine anxiety, not just about death, but about being forgotten. You pass through a valley where 3 burial sites sit unmarked, tucked into a slope near a waterfall. Locals say one of them belongs to a woman whose ghost never harmed anyone, but always stood at the window. Always. The story says her children left the village, never spoke her name again, and that the silence itself became the haunting. One man, years later, tried to restore the grave and offer a proper rite. But the effort failed. The records were incomplete. Her name, maybe, had been altered. The ceremony had no weight without the details. And in Icelandic ritual, naming is everything. You visit a farmstead where the owners keep a light burning in the loft year-round. They don't say it's for a ghost. They say it's for memory. But the tale is clear. A brother who disappeared, presumed dead, never named, and whose presence is still felt every winter. The family won't file a claim, but they also won't extinguish the light. And this is where things get deeply Icelandic. The belief that a ghost unresolved can become landscape, absorbed into fog, fold, and shoreline, always there, not frightening, but unignorable. A soft pressure on the soul of a place. Something that affects planting cycles, travel routes, even architecture. You've already seen houses built with rooms unused, corners left cold on purpose. In some cases, this was intentional. A way to give the forgotten ghost space to linger. One of the most remarkable records you find is a legal petition, not to address a haunting, but to restore the right to forget one. A man named Jorun petitioned his village to stop retelling the story of a haunting that had plagued his family for generations. "We have named it, we have buried it, and still we are not allowed peace," the letter reads. He asked that the story be formally sealed, spoken one final time in the presence of the assembly and then never again. The court allowed it. A final rite was held. The ghost was, in legal terms, retired. But the village still whispers the tale. Because in Iceland, forgetting isn't easy. You stop beside a small pool where moss creeps thick over every stone. No one steps in. They say a man was buried nearby without his tools, and now the water never warms. No lawsuit, no ritual, just the story, just the cold. And maybe that's the point. Sometimes the ghost isn't there to be soothed or appeased, or even remembered fondly. Sometimes the ghost is what remains when no one does anything at all. Snow falls gently now, thin and slow, like ash from a fire you don't remember starting. You cross a stretch of heath where nothing stirs, no birds, no wind, only the faint creak of your boots on frost-hardened ground. The village ahead is quiet, not abandoned, but settled, the kind of quiet that comes from centuries of living with stories instead of solving them. This is where you begin to understand what happens after a haunting becomes history. When the legal claims fade, the rituals conclude, and the ghost, once disruptive and demanding, becomes a character in local memory, folded into the identity of a place like a knotted stitch in a family quilt. Today's lesson isn't about fear or trial, it's about integration. Because Icelandic communities didn't always chase ghosts away. Often, they simply made room for them. And once that happened, the ghost ceased to be a problem. It became a presence, a rhythm, a known silence between words. You're told of a barn where a revenant once appeared each spring, walking the loft 3 times before disappearing. No one filed a suit. No one performed a rite. They just acknowledged it. That's her way, they'd say, and leave the loft undisturbed until after she'd made her rounds. The haunting became a calendar marker, like lambing season or the first frost. In another village, a man who had long terrorized his neighbors in life began showing up in dreams after death, always demanding that someone repair the church roof. At first, this caused a flurry of concern. But over time, the dreams became something else, a shared narrative. Old Ericor and his shingles, people joked. Eventually, they repaired the roof, not because they feared him, but because the story deserved an ending. Historians still argue whether these long-term hauntings were belief-based or culturally performative. Were the people truly seeing ghosts, or simply keeping alive the memory of unresolved tensions in symbolic form? The answer, predictably, is both, and it's in that ambiguity that the most Icelandic ghosts live. You enter a longhouse warmed by an open fire. On the wall hangs a tapestry embroidered with a tree, a house, and a small black shape near the door. That's the watcher, the weaver says. He used to knock when someone was about to be born. You ask if she believes in him. She shrugs. I believe in what happens when we stop talking about him. These integrated hauntings often carried with them a strange tenderness. The ghost no longer frightened, no longer soothed, no longer required appeasement. It had been accepted, folded into lullabies, border stones, carved beams. You hear a cradle song that includes the line, "If you hear the third step creak, greet her kindly, don't you speak." No one knows who she is anymore, but the song remains. You read a fragment from a village record stating simply, "The grave was never moved. The flowers are enough." That line became proverbial, used to describe situations where no formal resolution is needed, only acknowledgement. And perhaps that's what ghost trials were really moving toward all along. Not erasure, not conquest, but a way to bring the dead back into the fold, gently. To say, yes, we remember. Yes, we hear you. And now, we're going to live anyway. One of the most haunting places you visit is also the most peaceful. A field where no lawsuit was ever filed, no rite ever performed. But each spring, the children walk a path through it, holding hands, singing a verse about a hidden face in the soil. They don't run, they don't shout, they move as one, softly, like they're not alone. The village has done this for generations. No one remembers when it started, but they say the crops grow better after. You sip broth in a home where the back room is never entered on Thursdays. Not because anyone sees anything, but because once, long ago, someone did. You ask why they still keep the habit. Because it costs us nothing, your host replies. And the memory costs us everything if we lose it. So this is how it ends, not with the ghost banished, but with the haunting transformed. What was once a disruption becomes a ritual. What was once a lawsuit becomes a lullaby. What was once a fear becomes a shape in the weave of everyday life. And maybe that's what ghosts truly are in Iceland. Not spirits, but stories that refuse to leave until they've been properly placed. Once placed, they don't vanish. They simply settle, like snow, like silence, like history. The sky hangs low with silver weight, the kind of overcast that turns the world to soft charcoal, every sound muffled, every movement deliberate. You walk slowly now, through the last of the ghost-touched landscapes, past farms that have settled into stillness, past doorways that once creaked from footsteps no one could trace. The village ahead greets you not with suspicion or ritual or whispered warnings, but with a quiet familiarity. This place knows its ghosts, and its ghosts know their place. Tonight, you're arriving at the end of a long and winding thought. What does justice mean when the wronged party refuses to stay dead? And more importantly, what does it mean to live with that wrong once the ghost has spoken? Because in Iceland, as you've seen, ghosts were not exiled. They were not always exorcised, or feared, or even hated. They were answered. This final village offers no great drama, no violent haunting, no glowing revenant moaning across the fens. What it has is a single stone by the gate, etched with a name, and beside it, a small copper bowl where someone leaves drops of cream each Thursday. It's just something we do, the farmer says. For her. You ask who she is. He pauses. One of ours. She had complaints. Then he laughs, not nervously, but knowingly. Like someone who has lived long enough to accept that some things don't end neatly, but that doesn't mean they can't be held gently. The law here isn't just what's written. It's what's remembered, what's repeated, what's responded to, even if the response is just a whispered apology in the garden or the soft setting of an extra bowl of broth at supper. The ghosts of Iceland didn't ask for obedience. They asked for acknowledgement, and in a culture built on spoken law, on shared stories, on standing stones and remembered names. That was the most sacred form of justice. Historians still debate how literal all of this was. How much of the legal ghost lore was belief and how much was social storytelling. But to reduce it to either is to miss the point. In Iceland, the haunting was always both, and in that duality lay its strength. You sit beneath a sloping roof and sip something warm and sharp, flavored with juniper and memory. A woman beside you tells you her grandmother's favorite saying, "The ghost only lingers where the name is lost." You nod, because now, after 25 chapters, 40-something ghosts, and at least a dozen cows who refused to cooperate with the undead, you finally understand. Ghosts in Iceland were never about horror. They were about reckoning. They showed up not to spook you, but to make sure you did what you were meant to do, what the law, the land, and your own memory demanded. And when they were heard, truly heard, they didn't need to come back. And maybe you'll remember that. The next time something creaks in the attic, or a name floats to mind that you haven't spoken in years, or a shadow crosses a threshold just a little too slowly. Maybe you'll say the name aloud. Maybe you'll leave a stone. Maybe you'll do nothing at all, except pause, and feel the weight of a story that still lingers in the air. Because ghosts, in the end, don't demand fear. They ask for space. They ask for memory. And once they have it, just enough, they sleep. So now, dear listener, the snow drapes the hills like a woolen blanket, the wind has calmed to a whisper, and the last echoes of Icelandic ghost stories fade into the hush of sleep. You've wandered through haunted doorways and witnessed lawsuits with no living defendants. You've heard the footfalls of the forgotten and watched families pass down rites like recipes. But more than anything, you've seen how a place can treat memory with structure, with ceremony, with care. Let that settle with you now. The idea that not every disturbance must be erased, only named. That justice doesn't always look like punishment, sometimes it looks like acknowledgement. And maybe, in your own quiet world, that thought can offer comfort. We all carry our echoes, our unfinished business, our unnamed names. But you've seen how even centuries-old wrongs can be resolved with nothing more than a spoken story, a candle lit, a corner left undisturbed. Let that quiet strength stay with you. Let the weight of Iceland's cold air soften into something safe, something still. Your breath slows. The flicker of the imagined hearth dims. The ghosts are quiet now, not gone, but resting. Their work is done, and yours, for now, is simply to sleep. Good night.